This is a Film Stories original podcast. We made this.
Hi, I'm Frank Spotnitz. I produce The X-Files, and you're listening to The X-Cast.
Welcome back, everybody, to the X-Cast. As ever, the truth is in here. I'm your host, Carl Sweeney, and thank you for joining me for this discussion about the 22nd and final episode of Season 6 of the X-Files, which is Biogenesis. And to discuss this one, I'm joined by two men who regularly display signs of irregular brain activity, the likes of which I've never seen before. Namely, Kurt North, first of all. Hi, Kurt.
How are we doing? You all right?
Yeah, I'm all right. This season's gone quick, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's gone really quick. I'm really surprised, actually. I thought that, we've doing the Millennium Show over on The Time Is Now and how long that takes. To share it between three of us, surprisingly, it speeds things slightly up. but yeah, it's been a great season as well. So I've really enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed listening to other people's reactions and recordings and stuff as well. So yeah, amazing to be here already.
Yeah, that's always the highlight for me, is listening to the bits I've had absolutely no input into whatsoever. And we're also joined by Darren Mooney. Welcome back, Darren. Good to have you.
I'm glad to be here. Glad to keep things spinning, as it were. And flying through the air at your bookshelves. Whole new meaning to a holy book. It's
good. Yeah, like I say, it's good to have you back. I think it was the Two Fathers One Son doubleheader, wasn't it? We spoke on last. So
it was indeed. So it's been an interesting half season, so to speak, since then. I think more than half a season, actually. I think they're slightly earlier because they're November sweeps, aren't they? Yeah. So yeah, it's been an interesting back half of the season.
Is this the first Myth Arc episode we've had since then? It probably is, isn't it? Unless you count any unnatural, but like a pure Myth Arc episode.
Yeah, I think so. And again, it's probably worth noting that there's a lot in here about that. There's a lot in here basically about what the hell do we do now? Now that we've burnt most of the supporting cast alive, we've immolated the idea of the colonists and the kind of rebels and all that sort of stuff that was dragging it, that was kind of a weight around the show's neck at this point. Purity control is just gone. So what the hell do we do for a season finale? And the answer is biogenesis.
Yeah. For better and worse, potentially. No, good to have you here. Good to have you here, Kurt, as well, because I know you're a big Myth Arc guy.
I am.
We would have had Sarah. I don't think she actually likes mythology post, I don't know, definitely post 2001 Sun, but probably a bit earlier, to be honest. But we'll be back with Sarah on the next episode, I can say. So yeah, we're here to discuss Biogenesis, written by Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz, directed by Rob Bowman. This episode first aired in the US on the 16th of May, 1999. According to Wikipedia, it aired in the UK and Ireland on July the 25th, 1999. I thought the gap was longer, between the US air date and us getting it.
It used to be when it was on BBC. When it was on the BBC, it was quite a length. I think they're pretty much, from if memory serves me right, they're pretty much caught up around season 3 or 4. I think it was somewhere around there that the thing became a lot quicker. I think
Tony's mentioned buying the actual the VHS copy of the Paperclip trilogy, before it was shown on BBC, which never would have happened. And I think because again, this is all inside baseball, but because Sky One in the UK is a Rupert Murdoch brand, one imagines that was probably a large part of why it was so easy to get a Fox TV show over here. And that would probably be something that we discuss next year when we discuss the wondrous departure of David Duchovny from the show over debates about possibly swindling him through selling this international and kind of domestic syndication rights for the show. Yeah.
But still, I mean, just over 2 months gap then between the US air date and us getting it here. That never used to bother me back in the day, but can you imagine it these days? It would be intolerable, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It's hard to believe. I mean, I know you're watching Lost at the moment, Carl, but the Lost was probably the first one I recall seeing where it was simultaneously cast at the same time. It was like 2:00 in the morning, like what Game of Thrones did. And I remember even Lost was like a good maybe a few days ahead or a week ahead. And I know that obviously recently it's been one day, hasn't it? It's been literally, you watch something on a Sunday and we get it on the Monday, and obviously streaming's taken on. So it's it's so much better when it's like that. And obviously, if we want to go back to X-Files and that drastic issue during seasons 10 and 11, then we had similar kind of problems there, didn't we?
Well, I just used to have to mute a lot of terms on Twitter and avoid it all, however long it was until we could actually see the episode. But if you'd have told me I would have had to do that back in 1999, I would have said, what's Twitter? So anyway, this, of course, is the episode in which Mulder and Scully investigate an artifact found in the Ivory Coast and the death of the scientist who brings it to the United States. So, gentlemen, just general thoughts on Biogenesis, really, and a mark out of 10. Darren, how about you to kick us off?
I actually really like the Biogenesis trilogy. It is a very, very, very odd set of 3 episodes of television. It's a very odd set of 3 episodes of The X-Files. And a large part of that's down to everything that I mentioned before, which is the idea that, you had your big sweeps episode that was wrapping up the mythology, tidying away a lot of stuff that was kind of left dangling from the movie. And the question is, what the hell does the show do now? Because obviously you can't return to the well. And in particular, the idea, the unspoken assumption behind the scenes, and if you read a lot of interviews from the 7th season, a spoken assumption behind the scenes that the show would be ending in its 7th season. So there really wasn't that much impetus or, sort of justification for setting up a whole new mythology with new characters, with new ideas, with new kind of new engine driving it, basically, as it would say in the 8th or 9th seasons. So what you have in this 3-parter is a very odd collection of things that have interested Chris Carter in earlier episodes, in particular things that interested Carter before the myth arc took the shape that we know and love around the Anasazi trilogy. Once that kind of the 2nd and 3rd seasons kicked off, you started seeing a lot more of the elders, you started seeing characters like the well-manicured man reappearing. What's interesting about Biogenesis is that it often feels like an island of misfit toys, of little threads and ideas and concepts that Carter played with in earlier episodes, like, say, Red Museum or Fearful Symmetry, places like that, and never really kind of managed to weave into the main thrust or the main narrative of the myth arc. So it becomes this kind of box of kind of loose ends, oddities that don't really fit together. And it's remarkable as a season finale, Biogenesis, because it's surprisingly non-propulsive.
Yeah.
If you look at, the previous season finales, and again, the Erlenmeyer Flask, Anasazi, Talitha Kumi, Gethsemane, and The End, they're all built as engines that are building towards something huge and dramatic and epic. Obviously the death of Deep Throat, for example, Mulder being burnt alive, the kind of even the very tense standoff in the junkyard in Talitha Kumi, for example. But obviously Mulder's suicide in Gethsemane and the burning of the X-Files in The End. Here, it's much more mellow and much more contemplative and much more abstract. There's no real sense of nobody's ever running to jump onto a train or running to stop somebody from jumping onto a train. Instead, there's a bunch of people wandering through corridors, debating the nature of human existence, and not one, but several Chris Carter monologues on, the nature of God in the universe.
Yeah.
And I understand why that doesn't work for a lot of people, and I understand that this doesn't make for, the peak X-Files television experience. But I also kind of love that the show was you know what, Beckett, I want to do this. This is what we're doing. So I've always admired the 3-parter for that.
Yeah.
And if I were to give it a mark out of 10, Biogenesis for itself, I'd probably give it a 7.5. I don't think I could justifiably go higher because there's a lot of there's a lot of loopholes and gaps here. There's a lot of aspects where the plot is unnecessarily loose. There's a lot of things that happen off screen that don't really need to happen off screen given how little is happening in the rest of the episode. You could maybe trim one of the monologues and actually have a much tighter formal plot structure. But on the other hand, again, I just admire the fact that it said, yeah, Beckett, we're doing this week. We're doing it this year. This is what we're going out on. So yeah, a 7.5 for me. I really like this episode.
Good stuff. So by comparison, I think you were a 6.5 on One Sun, weren't you? So big step up from there.
We're all going up, baby. Up.
What about you, Kurt? Where would you go? Would you go higher than a 7.5 or
I would. Yes, I would. I think I've reappraised this a few times in the last few watches that I've done, really, and the deeper I look into it, the more I actually really like it. I think some of the abstractness that Darren was talking about is right, and some of the aspects of like bringing God and science together and stuff like that, it's maybe a bit too much for me to contemplate, and a bit on the nose for me with regards to that. But actually, on reappraisal, looking at certain things that happen within the episode, I'm sure we'll talk about them, that I love this, what Darren said there about things not happening on screen. It does happen quite a lot. There's a lot of things that do hover around the actual story, and I like some of the aspects that they have done for the likes of Anasazi and stuff. I like that we've got 3 players. There's nothing really happening, but there's could be a start of something. There could be, Krychek's got his own agenda. Cigarette Smoking Man, even though he appears for all of 25 seconds, has his own kind of thing. You've got different strands, like sort of spanning over the top of this as well, where it feels like, almost like for me, like Krychek's in the race to have the power, because Cigarette Smoking Man's in the dark and stuff like that, which I really find intriguing. And it's almost like they've literally wiped all the chessboards off and have just gone, right, let's reset the board and make our first move. And it's just the fact that they're contemplating which pawn to move, I think. So, yeah, really interesting. And I would give it a solid 8 out of 10 for me, personally.
I'm between you both. I'm a 7.75. Oh, I like this episode. The reason I give it that is because I was thinking, well, I gave Two Fathers a 7. I gave One Son a 7.5. I do like this more than One Son. So yeah, I'm going 7.75. I like it. It feels fresher to me than that two-parter does. Although, interestingly, it's not as fresh as I remembered it being, because it does rely on some familiar beats and characters and things. There are aspects that do feel new. I think what Mulder goes through in particular. I like that it's tackling ambitious questions. I really do. And we'll talk about it. But that stuff is also jostling for attention with other elements that maybe are a bit more conventional. I think it's quite an uneven, jagged episode in some ways. Like, I don't think the way it integrates all of the supporting characters is entirely satisfying. But this episode, for me, is more satisfying than the sum of its parts. And I think the trilogy is also more satisfying than the sum of its parts in some ways. Because some of the moments here are very striking. I think they produce kind of an after effect in that they actually linger in the mind, beyond the experience of watching the episode. So I think this is a good one, yeah. Where do you think it sits in the sort of pantheon of season finales? Like, it's not top of the tree, is it, for X-Files season finales, Darren? Or how high do you think it ranks?
It's probably solid middle for me. I think it's better than the end. I think it's a much better episode than the end, because the end was largely, well, we have to get through this whole bunch of stuff before we get into the movie. And you could get a sense watching the end that Carter he'd already done the movie, and he'd already decided what he was doing after the movie. So the end was just, okay, fine, this is housework. Whereas this legitimately feels like, well, I've been thinking about this for a while, and guess what, we're doing it. I don't think it is as propulsive and engaging as, say, earlier episodes, like obviously, Anasazi, or even the Erlenmeyer Flask. I think Requiem is a much more moving piece of television. I think that Essence and Existence are the perfect series finale for the X-Files. And in hindsight, I'm really glad that they never made any more X-Files after that series finale, But no, all joking aside, I think it's obviously better than The Truth. I think it's better than either of the 2 revival finales. So probably does end somewhere kind of in the middle. It's probably closest to Gethsemane, actually, in terms of like tone, because it has that same funereal atmosphere, that same sense that this is like the end of something, or the end of something is approaching. And, again, Gethsemane being literally named for the moment of doubt that Christ has on his journey in order to underscore the religious themes of what we're going to be talking about this week. So I kind of nestle it with that, which is an episode that I have a great deal of fondness for. I think Gethsemane's a lot better, but it kind of maybe as a nice pairing with that, perhaps, is probably where I'd rank it myself.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's definitely behind the Erlenmeyer Flask, Anasazi, Requiem for me. And then there's a middle bunch, which includes episodes like Gethsemane. I'd probably put this between Gethsemane and the end. And, who knows? There's a few in the middle for me. What about you, Kurt? What do you reckon?
Episodes that you haven't touched upon, just that come to mind is Talitha Kumi. I think it's better than that. So I'm very similar. I think things like Existence, Requiem, I watched today actually. I thought it's a strong point, but I think it's really interesting watching this episode and Requiem without having the 2 of the 6 extinctions, which is what I did today, which was really interesting. So yeah, I mean, I would say it's middle of the pack. I'd say exactly the same as what Darren said. I think it's around the Gethsemane sort of era, sound, that kind of aspect to it. I think this would potentially go ahead in my estimation for it. So yes, I think it's in the same sort of company that we're all saying, really.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, what I propose, gentlemen, is that we, any production details or whatever, we can kind of go through as we go along. But before we actually do jump into the episode, just finally, IMDb. Yeah, I'll let you guess. Let's see who's closest. Always a bit of childish fun. Darren.
Okay.
What do you reckon?
Season finale. Important myth arc episode, but not as important as Two Father, One Son.
Yeah.
I'm going to say 7.9. That's my guess.
7.9. Kurt North, are you higher or lower than 7.9?
Yeah, I know. Is it highest, as close as without going over? Is that the game here?
Well, this is really strange. I'm used to asking Darren this all the time. I haven't looked at it either. I'm going to go much higher. I'm going to go 8.3.
Ooh, 8.4 is the answer.
Nice.
So Kurt gets the biscuit. Yeah, well done. 12th for the season, if you line up all the IMDb rankings. So solidly middle of the pack. Is that about right?
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'd be really disappointed if it came below like Aguamala or Alpha or something like that.
No,
but
I don't think so. Yeah.
But yeah, I can see it dropping below a lot of like the nice X-Files light stuff that everybody kind of really loves, including myself, like Drive or kind of, Triangle and stuff like that. And see does it place below Two Fathers, One Son then, I'm guessing?
It does. I think they were quite high.
They were very high, as I recall, yeah. Darren says, revealing and playing his hand on his opinion of Two Fathers and One Son. Yes, they were very high. No, people like what they like.
I mean, I'm assuming it came above things like Terms of Endearment, stuff like that, did it? And, says you got the likely of Alpha and Trevor and stuff like that. So it's above those.
It's above those. It's I didn't make a note of all the episodes. Yeah. It was way above Milagro. I mentioned on the previous episode, Milagro is quite low in IMDb, which is interesting because a lot of fans really like Milagro. But yeah, it was behind stuff like the Dreamland two-parter, Two Fathers, One Son, Tivernus, Drive.
Yeah. I think it's about right, though. If you're looking at like Terms of Endearment and stuff like that, which I know Trevor I've reappraised recently, I think was really good. But I think it's above that pack. Personally, for me, from a mythology point of view, I would put it higher. But I can see why it's landed where it's at.
But on the flip side, it doesn't contain a sequence where Mulder drives a convertible to the tunes of Garbage, I mean...
Nothing wrong with Shirley Manson.
That's got to be at least a full star, bump on your rating, right?
Yeah, but Biogenesis has probably Kurt's favourite Diana Fowley scene. So
do I talk about that now, or do I talk about that later?
No. The time will come. Don't worry. In fact, let's make some progress towards that moment now, because let's talk in depth about Biogenesis. So what a teaser, guys. Scully voiceover from space. It appears an abstraction. I'll just give you some of the highlights. This is all about the emergence of life, great mass extinctions from millions of years ago, the evolution of plants and insects, this cycle repeating again and again. Some footage from Fight the Future, interestingly, alongside the stock footage and all that.
Hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's not 35,000 BC, though.
Oh, is that right? Oh, okay, yeah.
Little continuity error. Let's talk that. Otherwise, everything else in this episode makes perfect sense.
I love some of the questions in here. Is there a plan, a purpose, or reason to our extinction? And then, of course, we get the scene that is set in the Ivory Coast for discovery of the artifact on the beach. And Scully is asking whether the mystery will be revealed through a sign, a symbol, a revelation. So this is all very, very Chris Carter, isn't it? It's reminiscent of some prior mythology voiceovers in a sense. It's asking the big questions, which I love, but arguably in a somewhat inelegant fashion, in the sense that you actually got your protagonist phrasing these big questions as rhetorical questions. But I like it because I admire the swinging for the fences. How about you, Darren?
Absolutely. And I mean, again, it's notable he does it twice in this episode. Scully has another moment later on where she literally stares at the stars and kind of contemplates the meaning of life, which it's like doubling down on this, which I kind of adore. And to be fair, I will say, as far as Chris Carter, monologue and voiceover goes, we're not hitting those kind of like heady highs or lows of like Redux Part 1, where characters are wandering through grey corridors as these voiceovers continue at length. At least the kind of visual element is engaging here. And again, I think that it works in terms of like setting the tone for the episode that you are about to experience. Particularly if you watch the 3-parter as a whole, which I did today, and then rewatched the first part to make sure that I didn't get them all mixed up in my head, because it kind of very much sets the tone. This is and again, I kind of hesitate because this is very pretentious, but if you look at how these episodes are structured and paced, there's a sense of poetry to them where all of them begin and end on a beach. This one obviously begins with the finding of the, artifact on the beach and ends with Scully arriving on the Ivory Coast. The Sixth Extinction has its own kind of beach beginning and ending. And then obviously the Sixth Extinction 2 Amor Fati has like Mulder finding the child on the beach at the start and then at the end rejoining the child to rebuild the sandcastle again. And I kind of admire that. Again, it's notable for all that these are season bridging kind of stories. The big cliffhanger reveal at the end of this episode, not to jump ahead, but it's important structure-wise in terms of setting tone. The big cliffhanger reveal at the end of this is that Mulder has lost his mind and has gone completely insane and been locked up in a psychiatric institution. But that's not how they choose to end the episode. That's not the point at which they cut to black and say, tune in next season. Instead, they go, by the way, now what we're actually doing is we're going to a beach to contemplate the nature of human existence. And I feel like the episode kind of gets away with that, as absurd, as over the top, as kind of like chin-strokingly, navel-gazingly abstract as it is. It goes for it, and it never hesitates, it never flinches, and it allows it to get away with some really gonzo stuff, like Amor Fati. And I know this isn't the Amor Fati episode, but like, this episode that we're watching now is part of a larger story that also devolves into the last temptation of Mulder at one point, and somehow it's all part of a single story. And I'm kind of like, I admire that, and I feel like the teaser sets the tone. You watch this teaser and you're like, I have no idea what this season finale is going to be like. I have no idea where the next 3 episodes are going to take me. And I'm like, I'm happy to go.
Yeah. I think Kurt did the same as you, Darren, and rewatched the trilogy and then went back to Biogenesis, didn't you, Kurt? Yeah. I only watched this episode.
I didn't on this occasion. I did last week. I did. But I missed the 2 parts because I didn't want to get confused. So I deliberately today didn't watch the 6 2 episodes. So what did you make of this beginning to the episode, Kurt? You into all this stuff as well? It's to be honest, I generally, in some ways, sometimes skip this, but I think it's really interesting from an X-Files point of view, being the type of show that it is, that it's leaning towards what a lot of science fiction TV does, with using the Sixth Extinction as this like sort of death and rebirth. We've had the death of the Syndicate. We've had the whole show has been that now is going to go down a different route, and we'll come into another extinction because basically all the bets are off. I know we'll talk about this later on, but you've got that cigarette smoking man's bit very, very minutely saying, you've got the people in the background saying this is the end of the world kind of thing. So we're talking about another end of the world and, ready for a rebirth of another one. So the fact that you're getting this through Scully's, monologue here, that, we've had these extinctions before, but who sparked the original life is the big question. And that is a very science fiction trope that's gone down in a lot of TV shows that actually use that. So I think that in itself is interesting that they've kind of done that. The spiritual aspect of the way the monologue is dealt with, and you talk about redux and stuff like that before, Darren. I actually really enjoy that because the propulsiveness of it. This is very kind of spiritual, laid back, takes its time, and you just kind of like portray. You can imagine this being on a stage show at like one of those big like conventions where someone talks about biology. It's literally one of those sort of things. So it's really strange, but at the same time, it does set you up thematically for what they're trying to get across.
Yeah, well, I like them asking the big questions, like I say, because these will always be big questions. It's not, there are some episodes of the X-Files which don't date particularly well, but I think the less specific you get and the more abstract, There's something really interesting to that to me. And the other thing I like about it is it's a nice contrast with the post-teaser scenes, because you got this very wordy teaser, and then you got some dialogue light sequences, haven't we, in the Ivory Coast with the professor and the artifact, which flies off into the Bible, straight into the Book of Genesis, isn't it? So I like all that stuff. It's all suitably kind of portentous, and also a bit of novelty to the setting, Darren, isn't there? You know, this is back to the sort of globe-trotting in a way that we weren't really getting in 2001 Sun, where we were
locked in an aircraft hangar, and sort of like with a fire engine in the middle of it, which I still adore. I love that they're like, we moved the fire engine. It's like, no. It'll be a nice story when the colonists get here. We can explain what a fire engine is. It'll break the ice. It's a conversation piece for our kind of like aircraft hangar surrender thing. But what I do actually, and worth noting actually, just to go back to the teaser, one of the things I like is they do a very subtle thing where one of the images that they show when Scully asks like who the first creator was, who lit the first spark, that's the sky. It looks like the skyline from the X-Files opening credits sequence, particularly the bit where it's the truth is in here. You know, the bit where the lightning kind of strikes across the sky and the text appears. And again, kind of sets up this idea. And again, this is one of the things where I'm going to sound almost as pretentious as Chris Carter, and I say, what is the X-Files really about? But the idea that, you know, that the X-Files, you know, is obviously this conspiracy and alien invasion, all that sort of stuff. But it's also about these big existential questions that everybody was asking themselves at the end of the 90s. And the way in which, like, the prism of the aliens and the colonists was just a way of exploring that idea and getting into that sense of existential in a way that everybody kind of felt at that moment in time. We'll maybe come back to that in a second. But the globetrotting stuff is fantastic, because it's another example of the show using its location work really well, because it's like, now we're in Los Angeles, now we're shooting in California. You know, I mean, famously in Anasazi, when they wanted it to go to New Mexico, they had to go to a quarry and paint all the rocks red. Here, they actually have, because they're shooting in California, they can go, we can actually, we can't do swamps or marshland anymore. We can't do the big forests of Vancouver. We can't convincingly replicate those, but we can replicate the African coast. So yes, let's do the African coast. And one of the more interesting aspects of the three-parter, and particularly this episode in particular that I like, is the weird sense in which it's a really highly intellectualized and abstract version of Indiana Jones, in particular Raiders of the Lost Ark, because you have this tablet which has been broken up, needs to be reunited, and holds all sorts of mysterious power, which is very much what the Ark of the Covenant is. It's the tablets from the Ten Commandments from God that were shattered, and holds this great power, and this artifact that people are trying to track down and trying to control. I think Carter has said, actually, that it was going to the cinema and seeing Raiders of the Lost Ark that inspired him to, like, become a writer and to make television. So I kind of like the full circleness of that. And indeed, like, there are even, like, little sequences, like the moment where Barnes, like, leaves his office and he has to wander through this sea of students, which reminds me a lot of, I think it's like The Last Crusade, where, like, Indiana Jones gets back and he has to grade papers, that sort of stuff. And, you know, you have, like, the discussion of Barnes and this man, you name it, he's been there and debunked it. And I kind of, you kind of see these pictures of him, like, you know, sort of posing in front of the Sphinx. And again, you kind of get this sense of, oh yeah, we're doing Indiana Jones, except with monologues and, like, actually engaging in the question of who God is and what God wants. So I actually do really like the kind of, like, globetrotting aspect of it. I think it's clever. I think it's interesting. I think it fits the show. And I think it's an interesting contrast with that intellectualization, because again, like, the big difference between this and, say, Redux 1 is that Redux 1 has that kind of abstract quality to it, but it's grey corridors in the Pentagon and giant offices. Yeah. Here, at least, that's, like, that monologuing is juxtaposed against, you know, the Blessing Way ritual, that's, you know, in New Mexico, that's conducted, and is, again, looks really beautiful to look at, and, like, the Ivory Coast setting, which is on the beach, and again, looks very interesting visually, and so makes the background to this monologuing much more pleasing to look at, you know?
Yeah, there's something interesting there about Barnes that you mentioned. He's almost like the flip side to Mulder, isn't he? If Mulder's going around everywhere trying to prove the paranormal, then Barnes is traveling around trying to disprove everything. But actually in the episode, it's Scully who does the globetrotting, of course, which we'll come on to. Yeah. I like the artifact, Kurt, as of all the keys to everything in the X-Files that we've had, I prefer the artifact to somebody like Gibson Praise. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think, I've got alluding to another science fiction show, something like 2001 with the monoliths and things, that kind of aspect to it. I do. I think with regards to the etchings on the ship, I'm not as thing with. I think that's a bit too far for me. But I do like the idea of the the stuff that's on the ship that's causing things to happen. The whole idea of this artifact and the pieces that are degrading off it and falling off it and are being put together and fused together in different ways and stuff like that, I think really works. I think the as I say, this unkept power that it kind of alludes to later in the episodes themselves, I think works really, really well. One thing I will say about the actual strangeness about the artifact hitting the Bible and stuff like that, which always jumps out at me, is the almost like the underlying thing of, it's ridiculous at the end of the day. It's ridiculous, but it's trying to like suggest the power of words, which is something that the X-Files keeps coming back to, they even
Babylon.
Yeah, Babylon. You've got Jose Chung's from outer space, and Jose Chung says it, it's how people can be controlled purely by the power of words. Yeah, so it's really interesting how they use that. As I say, it's a bit on the nose to some degrees with some of the stuff we see. And I know it's referred to an actual, potential case, UFO case where somebody had seen like this mushroom-shaped thing fall through. And they say they saw like Egyptian kind of hieroglyphics on this piece, which is interesting in itself, whether or not they got that from there. But yeah, I think having the artifact and having it kind of abstract enough that it's not just an alien ship. It's actually something there that might not even be part of a fleet of aliens, if you will. It is something that's actually potentially for them as well. That actually means something to them, as well as not just being it's an alien spaceship that's landed. It could be something a lot more, a lot higher than that, which is really interesting.
It's a nice MacGuffin, I think, in the Hitchcock sense of it means everything and nothing. I think you can enjoy the adventure if you don't care about the fact that it's got the human genome written on it or whatever. But it's convincing that the characters would be into it all, I think. Yeah.
Actually, to bring it back to what Kurt said there about like the stuff written on it, which I actually really like. Again, this is very pretentious, and I really, really like it. But the idea that like it affects Mulder not by Mulder coming in contact with the object itself, but coming in contact with an image of the object and text from the object. And again, because this is an episode about religion, what I immediately think about, and this is the bit where Darren clarifies, I'm agnostic, I have my own problems with Richard Dawkins, so don't worry. This is not going to turn into a praise of Richard Dawkins section. But the idea that Dawkins had, I think, in 1976 with the selfish gene, where he invented what we now know as memes, which are these idea of kind of thought forms that are easily replicable and kind of spread from one person to another, like an idea. The idea of an idea going viral, as it were, on internet terms. The idea that it can infect you in the same way that, obviously a bacterium or a virus can. And I like and Dawkins, because Dawkins used religion as the prime example of this, the idea of religion as a self-replicating viral thought form, the idea that you read a book and it changes the way in which you see the world. You get this idea of religion and it alters the way in which you perceive the reality around you. And in an episode about religion, I kind of like that. The idea that Mulder looks at a piece of writing that he doesn't even understand, and it is enough to completely rewire and rework the inside of his brain. And again, it's something that I think kind of Carl mentioned this episode seeming quite timeless. And it does in some ways. I think there are other ways in which it's very particularly rooted in like 1999. But I think one of the ways in which it does seem timeless is I think we're a lot more conscious of that now in the internet age when we look at things like, and again, conspiracy theories are another example of this, but the way in which the exposure of people to ideas and the way in which people's minds and brains are like warped and altered by the way in which they are exposed to these things, and the way in which people think is altered by the way in which they're kind of fed this information. And again, you look at things like, say, the recent United States election, the QAnon conspiracy theory, Pizzagate, all this sort of stuff, these weird ideas, but they seem to get into people's heads and just alter the way in which they see the world around them. Mm-hmm. And I quite like that idea in Biogenesis, that it's like there's this thing, and it's not the physical object, it's not radiation, it's not anything you physically hold in your hand, it's something that gets into your brain. And again, very trippy, like, again, we're coming off, I think you talked about Field Trip with Chris Knowles. We're coming off Field Trip, which is an episode basically about Mulder and Scully and a giant magic mushroom. So it feels slightly appropriate that we're jumping into, Mulder's consciousness gets expanded by looking at this holy text. And I kind of, like, again, it's gonzo, but I love that the episode just says, we're doing it.
Yeah, let's come back to some of this, especially as it pertains to Mulder in a bit. But we go to the very generically named American University in Washington, D.C. Just a couple of points of interest for me. First of all, I quite like the discretion of not actually seeing the murder of Dr. McMillan. I like that. And just generally, do you guys get a sense of this being somewhat reminiscent of the Erlenmeyer flask? The monkeys in the cages, stuff like that?
Yes.
And I think other aspects of the episode will recall other Myth Arc installments too, won't they? But were you guys feeling this as well? Or?
I definitely did.
Yeah.
Right throughout this episode, like you say, we'll probably allude to a lot of them. I think that, and I think Darren alluded to this as well, that it's just like everything that you could potentially think about is thrown into this box of like, oh, that's happened there. Let's throw that in there. Let's throw this person in. Let's use that. Let's talk about this element. But yeah, it did feel very Erlenmeyer Flask to me. And again, going back to the 2001 thing with the bone, I always thought that the murder actually using the bone was interesting, and that the actual monkeys actually reacting to it as well was really good. But yeah, I mean, it did. Purity Control instantly came to mind while watching this on the first watch a couple of weeks back.
I do kind of wonder, like, how many people has Barnes murdered? Because he seems like he's pretty much ready to go. There's very little hesitation. The moment the guy goes, wait a minute, you're not Dr. Sandoz. He's like, ah! It's like, no, and afterwards, like, he has the forethought to, like, not only hide the body in a place that would incriminate Sandoz, but also to remove any parts of the body that would possibly expose the fact that he's been exposed to radiation. Like, how much thought has Barnes put into, because we find out later on, like, he's not an active part of the conspiracy yet. Like, he's kind of recruited by Krychek. He's just freelancing. Like, and again, it's gonzo and it's weird and, like, it's not something you're supposed to think about. But I kind of love that Barnes' first reaction is, I'm gonna murder this dude.
I thought it was quite amusing later when he's when they talk to him at the crime scene, and he doesn't even try and pretend to be kind of distraught. Just straight on to talking about his colleagues' laughable ideas.
Pseudoscience. They're happy to be printed in tabloids.
I was wondering, so of course, obviously we got Skinner sitting them down to talk about this investigation and all that, and then a very interesting scene I thought on the elevator.
Yes.
This is where Scully's asking what else Mulder could hope to do or to find. And of course Mulder says his sister. Now, Kurt, I don't know about you. Do you think this is priming the viewer to expect that Samantha will be a focal point here? Because, of course, the interesting thing is that she won't be. She'll be in Amor Fati in the dream scenario. I don't know. Do you think a first-time viewer is thinking that when Mulder says that, or do they take it as just kind of a reminder, or what?
I don't know. I think because of the way that it's said, I mean, we talked about Field Trip before, that it feels, the way it's filmed, it's just so slow that it doesn't feel like there's any urgency to get there. I mean, I never thought of it that way, but obviously I've seen it for several times, so it's difficult to put myself back into that position of whether or not I would have. But the things of his sister instantly, I'm instantly thinking of middle of next season kind of thing. And they have cleared the decks to a point. I mean, talking about, I think we'll leave it till Krychek's on the roof, and I'll speak a little bit more about that then. But there is elements that are coming into play already that I won't speak about just now. That it's it's putting Samantha out there forefront and center, but there's a lot of things happening in the background as well. But yeah, no, I don't know. I struggle with the fact of lack of propulsion, that it feels like we are going to get there in these 3 episodes.
Actually, what I really love that scene, in large part because, again, it feels like it's the show reflecting on itself. And again, this is one of the things I think I mentioned when I talked about, like, Two Fathers, One Son with Carl, which is, like, Two Fathers, One Son is nominally a resolution in that, like, it's the end point for the conspiracy in theory. A bunch of supporting characters, the elders, die. Although, to be honest, most of the major characters the audience cares about don't die. Krychek doesn't die. Marita doesn't die. Diane doesn't die, as we'll find out later in this episode. Cigarette-smoking man continues to survive. Skinner's still there. All those characters are still in play, but the mythology as it was is kind of dead. And one of the things that's interesting about Two Fathers, One Son is we never figure out the exact nature of the fallout from it. Like, we don't even know at this point whether, like, Mulder came down and discovered Jeffrey Spender's bullet-riddled body. We have to leave it until the 9th season to go, I guess he didn't, actually, because it's never really brought up or never really discussed. And I think that's kind of interesting because we never find out what the end of the conspiracy means to Mulder. Like, we never get that moment of catharsis or release that you would expect, which is Mulder has figured out exactly everything that the conspiracy is supposed to do. We never find out, like, does he expose them? Like, does he write up a report? Does he, like, try to publicize what they've done in any way, shape, or form? There's just a sense in which it's done and that's it, and we don't have to worry about it anymore, and the baggage is lifted. And one of the things I actually really love about the elevator scene here, because, like, Scully, I think, literally says, you won, Mulder. And that sense that you have in Biogenesis of, well, what now? What do you do after that? And again, this is where, like, again, Carl mentioned this being a kind of a timeless episode, and it is, but this being an episode that feels very rooted in the late 90s and you know, the 90s in general, because, you know, the 90s, we talked about this in the show before, is that era after the end of the Cold War, like after the fall of the Berlin Wall, liberal democracy triumphed. Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. Of course, he was wrong, but we wouldn't know that for another 2+ years at this point. There was a real sense of, well, what now? Like, Western liberal democracy had accomplished everything that it had wanted to do at that point. So what was there left to do? What was there left to fight? What battle was left to wage? What war was left to engage in? And I really like that Biogenesis kind of taps into that, because it's that exactly what Kurt mentioned, that lack of propulsiveness, that lack of forward momentum. And I feel like the episode gets away with it because that's kind of largely the point of the exercise. You get a real sense that, like, the writers are asking the same question Scully and Mulder are, which is, well, what do we do now? And the answer is arguably the same thing that, like, pop culture and a lot of young people did in the 90s, which is contemplate the uncomfortable nature of the emptiness of our existence and wonder whether God exists in the universe. And those are big questions that don't involve car chases or trains or, like, alien autopsies. So buckle in, kids, because this is gonna be fun. I really like that aspect.
I like the scene. I like the fact that Scully kind of preempts what some audience members might be wondering. I also like we get the first intimation of Mulder not being well here, don't we, with the slow-mo and the discordant noise and the slightly blurry image, which I think repeats a few times, doesn't it? Like when they go to the crime scene and Mulder, I think, tells Scully that he thinks the rubbing is what's causing his pain. So, Kurt, were you saying to me off air, I think you mentioned that you didn't like this aspect, did you? The paper rubbing. Is that what you said to me? You had a kind of problem with that aspect?
It's not so much that I think I had to, like, look at it again, and I did that this afternoon about just where it falls with me, because it feels like Darren said, it's the power, it's the thought of the power of words or the content within the rubbing itself, and I've had a bit of an issue with it, but the more I watch it, the more I think about it, the more I feel like there's an element of, you know, with especially the background radiation stuff, that there's, you know, and the actual physical, you know, there isn't just a physical element to it. There is the fact that Mulder was infected in Tunguska and Terma. And, you know, there's that sort of interconnectivity between the two. And, you know, he's a natural, you know, alien human hybrid rather than being a ready-made, scientifically made alien human hybrid and things like that, which I think I've struggled with for some time. But I think the rubbing, it just took me a little bit more time just to kind of reconcile that with how it all works. And I think listening back to Chuck's discussion on it, and you know, the fact that, you know, was it a fake? Is it a fake? What's happening here? Why is it happening? And similar to what the Genesis stuff was, you know, the fact that the artifact flies straight to Genesis. Yeah. It's a bit like, all right. And I think I've got my head around it a little bit more than what I did maybe even like 2 weeks ago.
I'm glad you mentioned Chuck Burks, because this is the only mythology episode we ever see him in, I think. Unless you were to cheat and count Leonard Betts in the sense that you get the revelation that feeds into the mythology about the cancer. But yeah, unusual to see him here. Unusual to see him at all. He doesn't get that many appearances. It's always nice to see him, I think.
But they even allude to it, don't they? the way they introduce him is like, Chuck, how are you doing, mate? Everything's all right. I haven't seen you for ages.
They flew you down to Los Angeles for this.
It makes you wonder if, you know, should the lone gunman have been there and weren't available or something? But I like seeing Chuck, so I'm not complaining.
Well, Well, I feel like the kind of like the way in which Chuck talks about things like, and again, this gets back to what Kurt was saying there, the idea of the magic square as something that exists in occultism rather than something that exists scientifically. And again, I quite like this, where it's the idea, the rubbing is very much like, this is not a hard science fiction story. This is not about like radiation or anything like that. This is straight up occultism. This is weird stuff. This is stuff that the lone gunman would laugh at, I think, which is kind of impressive.
I think one of my favourite moments in this scene, and this is not good podcasting, but it's Mulder's reaction when Scully says it's from outer space, and Mulder goes,
"Yeah,
that's really
it's
good.
Like a rock from Mars in 1996."
Yeah,
it's one of my favourite GIF files. That it's.
We also get the reference to the Navajo writing here, so this is fascinating to me. We get a return to some of the Anasazi trilogy stuff. So this reference to the writing, obviously the return of Albert Hosteen later in the episode. It's quite a deep cut, isn't it? In the sense that obviously it's a seminal trilogy, but we haven't gone back to that stuff like we have, say, the Black Oil, you know. There are some things in this episode which I think are kind of a crutch for the series, like the sinister return of the Smoking Man. And then there's other stuff here which is a bit more obscure in a sense, and that many viewers might not remember, might not have seen. You know what I mean?
Well, that's it. Like, this really feels like, and again, like, a large part of it is the, well, what now after we've wrapped up the mythology, but a lot of stuff is like Carter returning to ideas that he had never really got to fully develop because other ideas got ahead of him. Because, like, once you get into the third season, it becomes a lot more propulsive. I think when we talked about the third season, we talked about how all the mythology episodes in that season are building propulsively towards the end, as opposed to the second season, where, like, you know, Ascension and Dwayne Barry were written around Gillian Anderson's pregnancy, Colony and Endgame came from an idea from David Duchovny, and then like the season finale is kind of leading into the next season. Whereas if you look at the third season, you look at things like Nicene 731, you look at things like Apocrypha and Piper Maru, those are very much stories building on the same idea, the legacy of kind of World War II, what that means, and what that means in terms of what's coming involving aliens. And what I think I like about the Biogenesis trilogy, as messy as it is that it really feels like Carter's just going, here's a bunch of stuff that I couldn't really fit into that, like, big arc. So things like Albert Hosteen, who was in Anasazi and in that trilogy, but never came back. He's back. Yeah. Things like Chris Gow, who was in, like, Redux 1 and 2. He'll be back next week, even though he seems to be a completely new character. But who cares? We like working with John Finn. He's pretty awesome. Yeah. You know, even, like, as you mentioned, Chuck Burke is back here, for example. And the fact that, like, the biggest touchstone here in terms of early mythology episodes isn't anything about colonization. And again, I don't think the words colonization are mentioned in this episode or in the next one. I think they're alluded to, and obviously when Mulder has his last temptation of Mulder vision in, like, Morpha-T. But, like, they're not really mentioned here. Instead, the aliens are presented in the same way that they were as, like, walk-ins back in Red Museum in the second season, or as, like, these religious entities, like, collecting an ark, like they did back in Fearful Symmetry. And those are very deep cuts, in large part because, like, Fearful Symmetry is a terrible episode. And I think the production team have all but owned up and said, yeah, that was a mistake. We should not have done that. You know, when we realized we couldn't do an elephant stampeding through the street, we probably shouldn't have tried to do an elephant stampeding through the street, but insist that it was an invisible elephant to save on the budget. But, like, you can see Carter going, actually, I didn't get to play with those ideas as much as I wanted to, while I was talking about purity control, while I was talking about the black oil, while I was talking about colonization. So now that that plate is cleared, let's just reach into the grab bag and grab whatever's wiggling around inside. And that's what we're doing. So I like the weird deep cut nature of this. I like that it's the odds and ends. And it feels slightly kind of metafictional because it's like, again, the X-Files is winding down. The only bit of mythology that's left to be resolved at this point is, as you pointed out, what happened to Samantha. And that's going to be solved next sweep. So don't worry too much about that. So I really like the sense of, well, what's left in the tank? Let's just put it all out there, kind of aspect of the 2 episodes, or 3 episodes. Yeah,
I like that stuff. I think there are a couple of elements that I find a bit perfunctory, maybe, perhaps Krychek, but this stuff I really like, yeah. Kurt, I was wondering what you make of the fact that Mulder is acquiring this kind of psychic ability, you know, because I know you've just finished recording The Time Is Now. Do you feel like Mulder is almost turning into Frank Black, almost? You know, he's got this gift now. For all that there are some familiar bits to this episode, this stuff with Mulder does feel more original and potentially very significant, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, my only issue with it is that it lasts for these 3 episodes and that's it. Where it's kind of like all right, okay, let's deal with this. Let's have a bit of this involvement of the fact that the alien DNA is able to adjust itself and create this moment with him. And as I say, with the allusion to the fact that the fact it's Tunguska and Terma, that's the whole reason why it's being activated in him and it wasn't Scully, for example. I know there's various different decisions being made on that where Scully was infected in the film and whatever, but I think an argument is that the Corn have said the argument is that she was inoculated with a much stronger vaccine than Mulder was in Tunguska and things. So there's narrative ways around it that which I quite like delving into that aspect of it. But speaking about Mulder himself having these abilities, what I particularly like about it that's something that another show might have gone down the route of is that the very word oral dissonance is used by Mulder at one point. And it's not the case that he's hearing exactly what somebody is saying. It's the fact that everything is a cacophony of everything that's hitting him, that he's not developing this after, like what Frank Black would eventually, maybe suggest that he has this ability to see in the killer's mind and actually see what the killer sees and stuff. Where this feels like he's just having a cacophony of standing in the middle of a football field with 70,000 people around you. That would literally, be the death of him. And you think back to like Gibson Praise, for example, the fact that he would potentially be the same sort of thing that, he's managed to hone his skills with regards to that, which is a nice little touch. It's a nice little development of all 3 of those aspects of it. I think I like it. I like the fact that there is this we've always been Mulder and Scully investigating, finding out what's going on. When the actual X-File becomes them, it's really interesting. And the fact that the X-File has become Mulder, is interesting in itself. And then obviously, looking at, TV shows in the future that there would, Marvel, for example, or whatever, or even Fringe and stuff, where they use more of this element of what Frank Spotnitz was saying actually in the end, the fact that, things like tombs or whatever would be actually part alien. The fact that was the whole point of the show, and it just wasn't really alluded to. So I think it's a nice little touch actually. I think it's a lot more abstract, but I'm glad they didn't go down the route of apart from even Skinner, the bit where he's talking about Skinner saying, "There's somebody you're not telling me the whole truth." You're not getting Skinner going, "Oh no, he knows about Krychek." Oh no, it's a lot more abstract and a lot more different than that. It's more like, as you say, it's oral dissonance, which I like.
Signal to noise, which I really like actually as well, because again, one of the things that the X-Files is about trying to make sense of the world in the 90s and looking for the truth, and the truth isn't necessarily about colonists or aliens. It's about the nature of human existence and the meaning of life and all these big ideas that are somehow harder to explain than aliens want to invade in 2012. And I quite like the Biogenesis, okay, we dealt with the aliens invading, but there's still this big cacophony of noise and all these ideas that are radically different and are impossible to sort through. Mulder becomes an X-File, and Mulder gains this ability to read people's minds, and it just causes him to stop functioning. He opens himself up to the world, and the world doesn't make sense to him now that he can read people's minds. It doesn't provide any easy answers. It doesn't help him solve any of the great mysteries of the universe. Instead, having access to all of the information about everybody around him just causes him to double over in pain. Even when he's hiding from Barnes, or even when he's following Barnes, he kind of keels over. And I like that idea of there just being the idea that there's no one right answer. And in fact, trying to understand the truth, as it were, will drive you mad, possibly. Quite literally, as we get towards the climax of the episode. I think that's an interesting angle to take on this, particularly as Kurt pointed out, when the last time he saw this, it was Gibson Praise, and Gibson Praise was able to find a guy pointing a gun at him in a theater full of thousands of people, and just hone in on that. So I really like that aspect, I have to say.
I find it quite distressing actually to see Mulder afflicted in that way, perhaps because it escalates so quickly, doesn't it? If you think from those early scenes, then there's the scene with Skinner where Mulder's head down and he's reeling off all the stuff he said. That's the scene where they mention cosmic galactic radiation, by the way, which is a phrase I really like. But then to the stuff with Barnes later, yeah. We should probably mention Skinner, actually, because finally we get some development on the SR-819 stuff. I don't know if they ever made enough of those nanobots for me. I really liked the potential of that in SR-819, and it's used quite sparingly, isn't it?
I suspect if Nick Lee's, I wonder if Nick Lee's availability was the big issue here, because like he's here in this episode, but I don't think he appears in the other two. Like you see somebody run out of the room in the other two-parter, right. Yeah. But you don't get to see Krychek, and I suspect because I know that when they talked about bringing like Nick Lee and the actor who played Marita Covarrubias, Laurie Holden back for Requiem, they were like, we wanted to do this like repeatedly through the season, but damn those actors, and they're actually working and like having jobs and being difficult to book. So I do wonder if that SR-819 thing might have been down to the fact that
casualty of that.
Yeah.
It's a shame, isn't it, Kurt, I think. But we get the brushstrokes with Krychek here, which are reasonably, effective. But it does feel a little perfunctory to me.
I can see why you're saying it feels perfunctory. To me, I like what they were particularly envisaging, what in my eyes anyway, what they were envisaging was that the whole reason why Skinner gave them the case was because Krychek gave them the case. The fact that he's been ahead of the game for so long that Cigarette Smoking Man has now been mortally wounded with what's happened in 2001's Son. That he's now going and trying to make his own cabal by saying, by the way, the world is going to end and this is what's going to happen. And there's nothing you can do about it, which is effectively what the guys around the round table were saying. They were saying, oh, right, well, what can we do about it? Well, there's nothing you can do. We can just try and, deal with disaster, and deal with the issue when it arises kind of thing. But what I like with this whole episode with Krychek is that he seems to be actively engaged behind the scenes. Now, yes, you don't see enough of him, and that's a real shame. But for me, it feels like that what Krychek is doing, he's trying to create the conspiracy almost, or get power by being ahead of the game, by getting Skinner involved, using SR-819, for example, by going to Barnes and saying, we're going to work really closely together. You've got this whole kind of this race to find out what it is. Now it gets undersold towards the end of the season 7 when we come to Requiem, and he ends up at the Saudi Arabia prison, and he tried to sell it. Yeah. It's like there was more of a story there for me. There was more that we're ahead of the game with you than Cigarette Smoking Man is, and Foley, to be fair, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly, is that Krychek is ahead of the game, and it would have been nice to see that play out in a longer term, because it feels like this is the beginning of that, and it felt like there was like 3 or 4 chess pieces that could have easily have been moved into that position. Now, is it retreading? Not necessarily, but it is going down that route of, trying to create or trying to re-energize or sort of boot up a new either conspiracy, or at least trying to get some answers and then start seeing where the colonists were at that point.
Do you think, though, that a casual viewer, Darren, would have absolutely no idea what's going on with Krychek here?
Yeah.
And, would be missing a lot of the context, basically.
Oh, yeah, absolutely,
That's it exactly. Like, what I actually don't mind the kind of cigarette smoking man aspect of this episode so much, because I think that kind of works reasonably well, because like there's the sequence where, as kind of Kurt pointed out, he just takes a phone call, but in the background you can hear them talking about, oh yes, we're predicting mass casualties. It'll be an extinction level event. And like, one of the things that I kind of like about the conspiracy in the 6th and 7th seasons, like from Biogenesis and then through like Enemy and into Requiem, is the weird sense in which like the colonists have stopped returning the cigarette smoking man's phone calls, but he's still obsessed with them, and he's still like, this has been his life for so long that all he can do is keep doing this, even though nothing he will do will matter in any way, shape, or form, because the guys on the other end of the landline aren't answering. The guys who actually make the decisions aren't talking to him anymore. And he's kind of stuck doing this routine. And again, it's very similar to that conversation that you have with, in the elevator with Skinner, with Scully and Mulder, which again is something that happens repeatedly through the 6th season. And it's a big recurring motif. It's this idea, and again, I think it speaks to the show's existential anxieties, because Carter's talked about how he originally would have wanted to end the show after 5 seasons and then transition into a film franchise. And he largely stuck around because Fox said, no, we're going to keep making the X-Files. You can help us do it, or you can take a check and you can cash out. And he was like, no, I promised Duchovny and Anderson I would continue to do it as long as they did. So you get the sense in the 6th season, this recurring motif of, well, how long can we keep doing this? And at what point does us continuing to do this lose any meaning whatsoever? And, like, you can point to any number of examples. That wonderful conversation between, like, Mulder and Scully at the start of Dreamland 1, where she talks about how all they do is just drive in cars. The entire plot of, like, Monday, where Mulder finds himself living the same day over and over and over again. Even like that opening segment of Field Trip, where it's like, well, what would the end of the X-Files actually look like? We can't imagine that anymore. And, like, I kind of like that aspect of the cigarette smoking man here, where there's a sense of the cigarette smoking man cannot fathom the end of the conspiracy because it's literally his life. It's something he's devoted his life to. And the fact that it went up in smoke doesn't mean that he's not still holding meetings about it, even though those meetings logically have no impact on what's actually going to happen. So I like that. I think the Krycek stuff is, like, completely bewildering to any audience member who has not been following the ins and outs of SR 819. And I find what I find interesting about that is, like, the weird thing about the whole SR 819 thing is that, like, even though it's incredibly convoluted and requires you to be actively engaged and paying attention, it's also a very desperate attempt to kind of revert to a status quo where Krycek is the untrustworthy villain who's up to no good and has his own agenda, like always, and Skinner is the guy who has, like, a good heart, but is in an untenable position and is being forced to betray Mulder and Scully like he has been since he was introduced in the 2nd season, like he did when he did the cigarette smoking man's kind of dirty work back at the end of the 4th season, with, what was the name of the episode with the bees? Damn it, Zero Sum. Back in Zero Sum. Like, and like, the odd thing is that, like, it's a very convoluted way of resetting that status quo, which is what I find so fascinating about it, which is, like, if you were to jump into the episode, you would have no problem, like, as a casual X-Files fan going, oh yeah, Mulder and Scully can't trust Skinner again, despite all the crap he's been through with them, despite, like, taking a bullet for them back in Apocrypha. No, we're still at the we're not sure we can trust him phase. But in order to get there, you're like, oh yeah, they're also nanobots now for some reason. It's very convoluted, but at once, like, very back to basics. I find that kind of contrast fascinating, which again is probably something that happens after you built up 6 years of continuity, to be fair.
Well, also, kind of like with Albert Hosteen, where, okay, Scully sees the picture of him, this guy's going to be significant, and then the first time we see him, he's being wheeled away, and he's dying. And I find that's, it's very X-Files in a certain way, because if you think about what they did with Max Fennig, where he's been gone for years, and then he's brought back and immediately he's gone.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering, Kurt, from a more lay person sort of standpoint, a casual viewer.
You remember this character from 3 years ago, right? Well, he's in a coma now. It's like, oh, okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, as I say with Krycek, it's like, I can see through, but I have to like concentrate to go, right, what is he doing? Why is he doing that? If it takes me to go, right, I understand from a narrative point of view where they might be going with it, to do that. And as a fan of mythology, to think, oh yeah, I never thought of it that way. That's why he's trying to, like, get his, because he's power hungry all the time. He wants that power. He wants the information. Information is power, and that's what Krycek is always going to go after. If he's got a artifact sitting in a sea somewhere that he doesn't know why he sees this artifact and knows it's come from South Africa, that he needs to get that information before anyone else does. No one's going to know that the impetus is there for him if they're just coming into this. And it'd be strange to come into season 6, episode 22 for the first time, I must admit. But even for a casual viewer, it still would be very, very hard to understand the motivation behind it.
Okay, so we talked a bit about how Mulder's thing progresses, and he collapses in the stairwell, of course. Like I said, I find that quite distressing in its own way. And that's effectively him out of action for the remainder of the episode, because he's next in his bed, isn't he? And then he's confined. So that's all going on. And in parallel with that, there's Scully chasing down Dr. Sandoz, which there are a few shots of Scully in this episode I really admire. And the first one in particular is this very strange, beautiful shot where the camera gets really close to her face, which is not necessarily the obvious way to film that, but it's a standout moment for me.
Again, it's directed by Rob Bowman, though. Like, that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's like, this is the first season finale, because it used to be R.W. Goodwin who would do the series finale premieres. But, like, this is Bowman shooting, and it's Bowman shooting characters running around corridors and, like, meeting on rooftops. And Bowman is probably the most cinematic director the show's had, in that he literally directed the cinematic adaptation of it. And I love that he does that. There are a number of sequences of, like, characters running up and down stairwells that look unnecessarily cinematic and grandiose. And they work really well because they contrast with the relaxed pace of the episode around them. You mentioned that insane close-up on Gillian Anderson's face, because, like, again, the obvious joke, at the risk of being a bit like laddish, is like, well, if you just film a close-up on Gillian Anderson's face for 45 minutes, it make watchable television. But the angle that he chooses, he puts it, like, on the side of her face and like, not in profile, but intense close-up. And even, like, later on, there's the sequence we alluded to, where Barnes and Krycek meet for the first time, and it's a meeting of two blokes on a roof and, like, a VHS cassette there, but it looks so incredibly cinematic because you have the steam, and you've Krycek coming through the steam in silhouette, and you have the movement of him cut across with, like, the kind of vertical lines of the air vents, and it all looks really, really great. Like, again, it's characters in corridors and monologuing. It should not look this good, but it does, and that's to Bowman's credit, I would contend.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that shot of Gillian Anderson, and not in a laddish way, I just think that's a beautiful shot. I love the way that's composed.
Yeah, well, I think now, don't forgive me for those technical people that might sort of scream at me, but for me, it's very similar to a split diopter lens. And then the way that it's designed, so you've got, like, the two phases out of each other. That you've got and when she arrives at the screen, the back becomes out of focus. And
that's the one they used on Malcolm in the Middle a lot, if I remember.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, and they used it in WandaVision recently as well, because as part of that, as they kind of use that split diopter. Yeah, so it's but what I feel it's quite interesting within this episode as well is this sort of hearing, because it happens 2 or 3 times where we get similar, not necessarily the shot that it's as long as it is on here, but the Doctor, we have a moment where he's listening in and intently and hears it, and he hears the fire alarm. So there's a lot of this thing of this reoccurring motif of, like, hearing, like, the tinnitus that Mulder has is obviously a major case in point, but there's, like, the 2 other elements where it's happened quite a few times. So I just find it really interesting that, the even as well as the spoken word or the written word, the power of words, that hearing seems to be a big thing in this as well. But I do like that kind of split diopter, and I'm not entirely sure if that's the lens they probably use, but it does jump out to me that it's like that. So yeah, but a lovely cinematic shot.
Yeah, well, I like that you have 2 shots. You have this one where Scully gets very close to the camera, Rob Bowman's camera, and then you have a second shot later when it's the surveillance camera that she gets very close to as well in the office. Yeah. I think it's time that we talk about Diana Fowley, who has a memorable cameo in this episode. Kurt, can you just remind us why you like her? I mean, you've told me this a few times, and I can never get it straight in my head.
Right. Wow, shots fired from Carl.
It's not. You don't think she's used, like, particularly well, do you? But you just think there was potential with the character. I
think that it's potential for the character. I think this is probably the most potential that she has. I will straight away, before anyone even starts to turn the thing off, will say, why on earth did they decide for her to take her top off? I have no idea, apart from
and with a scare cord. Like the most remarkable thing about that is she takes off her top, turns around, and Mark Snow hammers the scare cord. It's the weirdest thing because it's very male gazy, but also, like, serial killer. She is both the object of the camera's gaze and the killer, and it's really creepy and uncomfortable. And anyway, sorry.
No, it's all right. No, well, I think it's too much. It's deliberately telling the audience you need to hate it, and I don't like it. I think it's very shallow in the way that it's done. I think it's not a great thing. I don't know why it's there. There is, strangely enough, if you, I'm going to mention another podcast here, X-File Diaries. Annie has a great defense of Diana. She says a lot of things that I actually think as well, but obviously she's a shipper, so she does go at a tangent to some points, but she has a great kind of discussion about it, and they talk about a scene which is not in the episode where Diana's talking to Mulder, And I think it's around this moment where she's actually in the room. And it's very much similar to the way that Skinner's talking to Mulder at the beginning of the episode, saying, "You're lying to me, there's something not quite there." And there's all that conversation going on about, you've got split loyalties. And I think that's where I really like the idea of Deana being brought in, because she's part of the history of the show. She's, I believe her in herself. She has, she has, yes, there's that soap opera feel to it. There's a whole aspect of, of this other woman kind of thing, which...
You're a liar.
Yeah.
You're a liar too.
Yeah, well, yeah. But there's the whole element of that as well. I do feel that she's badly done to, and it goes back to the discussion I had about we had there about Krycek and the story not being really overt enough. That I just feel that the character's been mishandled so much, but there was a good little goldmine of stuff you could have dealt with her. And I think this particular episode does that, because she's walking the line of, I'm with cigarette smoking man because of things that happened in early in the career that she felt that was her only choice, and cigarette smoking man had her at her lowest ebb. She still loves Mulder, and there was a lot of conversation you could have with that. And I think the way that Deana has this discussion with Scully about, well, what is the X-File? What is, I've worked on the X-Files. Tell me about it. Tell me what it is. I want to help. And in the deleted scene, it actually has the bits where she's like, he collapses on the floor and she feels like total empathy for him, because it's someone that she loves is in pain. So just stuff like that, which is never really, really dealt with. And then finally, I'll say this is my final moment for it, is again going back to this whole the liar aspect of what Darren just said there, was Scully saying, "You lie, you're both liars." Yeah. It's because she's trying to walk the line of, I want to care for Mulder, I want to get him well, but also working for the cigarette smoking man. Cigarette smoking man and Deana Fowley have no idea what's going on, and they're trying to probe and get that information. And you've got Krycek, who's ahead of the game. And I think that power, push and pull, really, really does work. And I think it would have been better if she'd been better written. It would have been a lot better.
This scene is just very odd to me, because if think from Mulder's perspective, the last thing he knows is that she's taken a phone call, and then she walks back in with her top off. What's going on?
Yeah, I don't get it. I don't get it.
I think there is potentially something interesting there, and this is where Darren is going to reach dramatically, and perhaps even dramatically overreach, where, if you wanted to be generous and you wanted to be this is being subversive and wry and clever, one of the interesting aspects of the X-Files as a whole is generally the way in which it reverses the traditional gender dynamics of the Mulder and Scully partnership, where traditionally up to this point in television and in literature and in film, it was always the man who was cold and hard and rational, and it was always the woman who was emotionally volatile and followed her instincts and had intuition. And the X-Files has always kind of played with that gender trope somewhat by making Mulder vulnerable, by making Mulder more traditionally feminine than masculine leads are allowed to be. Think of how much time Mulder spends crying, for example. And you could argue, if you're being extremely generous, and this is still extremely creepy, I want to be very clear, but it's still an argument you could make, where there's an element of sexual violation of Mulder there, where it's very clear what Fowley is going to do, and that Mulder is not in a position to resist. He's not even in a position where he would want to do it. The only reason Fowley is doing what she very clearly is going to do is because she wants to, not because she thinks he wants to, or she's plying him, or it's a way of manipulating him. And so you have this violation of Mulder in a way that is relatively uncommon for male leads in shows like this. And I mean, you could argue that I would certainly argue that One Breath does it better, where One Breath does the intrusion into Mulder's apartment, and that's treated as an intimate violation of Mulder, and he breaks down and he cries after it happens, and it's One Breath is one of the great episodes of television, in large part because it kind of deconstructs that idea of the masculine revenge fantasy by instead allowing Mulder to be vulnerable and to open up to his feelings and to treat him in a way that masculine leads are not treated in stories like that, generally speaking. And I think that's why One Breath is a masterpiece. This is not a masterpiece, to be absolutely clear, but I think you could, if you were being generous, say that it continues that trend in that it allows Mulder to be vulnerable in ways that male leads are not allowed to be vulnerable in television, and to be exploited in the way that male leads are not allowed to be exploited in television. Even if the show is not going to deal with that in any meaningful sense.
Exactly what I was going to say.
Whatsoever. And probably not mature enough to deal with it in any way whatsoever if it tried to do so, based on like Excelsis Day, to pick a random example from the show's history of dealing with themes like that. That said, what I will say I find interesting about this trilogy is that it reverses what's the traditional myth arc structure with Mulder and Scully, where traditionally in myth arc episodes and in big sprawling adventures, Scully is the one who is incapacitated or in hospital or victimized, and Mulder is the one who has to like run out and do action stuff in order to kind of like protect her or save her. Think of like Memento Mori, for example. Think of like Gethsemane and Redux, for example. Think of Christmas Carol, which Mulder isn't even in, and Emily, when he shows up and he's like, yeah, I'm gonna do some action stuff now. Whereas what I like about Biogenesis is that it completely reverses that. It actually kind of takes a leaf out of Anasazi and goes, no, Mulder is the character who is going to spend these 3 episodes being vulnerable and exploited and preyed upon, and Scully is going to be put in the unconventional position in these myth arcs episodes of being the one who ventures out into the world on some sort of mythic quest in an effort to save him, by like traveling across the world, having super cool adventures with zombies, and then kind of coming back and finding him in the end. And I kind of like that structure of it. I think the Foley stuff is not good. But I think I can see, if I squint, how thematically the Foley stuff fits with that, even though the show should not be doing that.
Well, that deleted scene, it's not a deleted scene, it's a script, it's just one of the draft scripts.
Okay.
The way that it deals with it is that, or the way I feel that they were dealing with it is that she was compromised, she's been compromised for a long, long time, and she did it for all good intentions, she just went down a bad path. That is much, much better, or dealing with that over the last 18 months, or having some indication of that would be a lot better than getting to a point of like just pissing everyone off by just going, I don't know, but I'm going to find out, and then do it that way. Because I just don't think that, it doesn't do anything for the episode. It doesn't do anything for Diana's character. It doesn't do anything for Mulder, and it doesn't do anything for the show. So I just don't understand why, if you've got that illusion in your head somewhere, and there's not the time to do it, then they've obviously just gone, look, Diana Fowler's not working. We've tried it in 3 different guises. It hasn't really worked. We're just going to shoot her off screen and let it be done.
There's a couple of things there. I think I like Darren's suggestion about it being a potentially quite a subversive scene. I think that said, I think then the music scare chord becomes a bit of a problem for me, because that pushes it into the realm of being a cartoon.
Yeah, it's camp. It's practically camp to be. Like, it's Mommy Dearest,
And I do like what you're saying about Scully as well, that she gets the kind of the action role. That kind of reminds me of the Erlenmeyer Flask as well, though.
Yeah.
Towards the end of an episode, Mulder's out of action and she's having to broker this deal and all that. But yeah, I do like it here. We mentioned CSM. I just wanted to say, who are these guys in the meeting? I suppose if Well Manicured Man and the First Elder and everybody were like the Beatles of the Syndicate, these guys are like the Wings,
Who's Lennon and Yoko Ono then? That's what I want to know.
What I really like, though, is it captures the sense of like that, like after lunch meeting on a Wednesday in the office where they're talking about like the supply chain for the vending machine isn't working, except like it's the genocide of mankind. I kind like that. That's the aspect that I really like about it. The idea that like life just keeps on ticking. That, and again, it's something that will come back in the 7th season as a big recurring theme. This idea of zombies and this idea of like, and again, if you want to read it as a metaphor for the show itself at that point, I think the show invites that reading. But this idea of something so big and so massive and so lumbering and so important to the people running it that it cannot be allowed to end, that it just keeps going past the point where there's any real reason for it to do so. These guys are just showing up to work because they've probably done it for the past 20 years. I kind of like that aspect of the scene.
Well, yeah, to be fair, I do like Wings, so I shouldn't have said that. Paul McCartney, if you're listening, I apologise.
Band on the Run is a great song.
It is. I love that album.
Live and Let Die, eh?
Yeah.
And I love his ashtray. Shout out to the ashtray. I love, like, part of me wants to think that, like, the first thing the cigarette smoking man did after, like, the events of Two Fathers, One Son was to go out and buy the biggest ashtray he could find just as, like, a power play. It's like, yeah, now we know who's running the show here.
Did either of you have any thoughts on the next Scully voiceover that we get? Because we get the healing ceremony and all of that. Again, it's all about the big ideas, albeit presented in quite an upfront way, again. But I like the style of X-Files voiceovers come in for a lot of stick. Now, generally, I like them, and I liked them at the time, and I still like most of them now. Okay, it can be a bit much, but it's done quite nicely here, I think. And, of course, I think you mentioned a moment, Darren, didn't you, where Scully's staring up at the sky?
Yeah. And I do actually really I like the second one more than I like the first one, because it actually feels kind of earned in the way that, like, that moment where Scully won't go in to the Blessing Way ceremony, where she won't let herself go in, but she'll peer in the door. And again, that's like, and I think that Carter said that, like, what he wanted to do, and again, this didn't happen. Like, to be clear, I'm not saying this happened, but what Carter talked about in interviews was in the 7th season, wanting the 7th season to be about a journey of Scully's science and Scully's belief in the paranormal and Scully peering through the veil and looking at things and embracing things beyond rational science. And I love that shot of her not being willing to go into the space where this Native American indigenous belief is happening because she doesn't believe it. It doesn't reconcile with her belief. She can't make peace with it, but still being drawn to it enough to, like, peer at it, and then inspired by it enough to stare at the cosmos and have this, like, big existential crisis. I unironically love that second voiceover. I think it works much better than the first, in large part because it feels earned in that moment, in that it's like, I'm in the middle of the desert. I'm around this mysterious ritual that I don't understand. Science can't explain what's happening to this man or can't solve what's happening to this man. But I see something that connects to me on a primal level. I believe in God, and I'm staring up at the stars. So what am I going to think about? I'm going to think about this stuff. And I like that the show's like, yeah, she's thinking about this stuff.
I think the camera view as well. The fact that you've got her looking up to the stars and the stars looking down at her, rather than, like I said, alluded to at the beginning, where it's like, you can imagine a massive 80-foot screen behind the person doing the narration to the first part, helps because, as you say, it feels earned, but it feels in the moment rather than, just like an ethereal kind of discussion, really.
And it kind of reminds me a lot of Carl Sagan, I think, wrote that we're all made of star stuff as well. It kind of, it has that sense of, and again, it's that thing that Scully makes Scully so fascinating as a character, is that she's Mulder's an atheist, but believes in aliens, and she's religious, but believes in science. Yeah. And there's always, and again, this is one of those things where, again, I'm an agnostic. I'm a lapsed Catholic, like most Irish people. That's the state religion over here, I'm afraid. But that idea that, in many ways, people tend to treat science and religion as forces that exist in opposition to one another, as if you have to choose one over the other. And like Dawkins, who I singled out, is probably the prime example of that. I know a lot of people who work in science, who work in medicine, who have profound religious beliefs like Scully does. And a lot of it's very similar to that stuff that kind of Sagan it's the argument that kind of Sagan makes, which is like, we're all the product of forces in a universe that we can understand, but God exists in the space between those. And if you stop and think about it, the fact that, like, every atom in our body was once part of a star, and the star that we're orbiting is itself the product, I think it's a third generation star, so all its atoms have been through the universe as well, that's something that is spiritual. Like, it's rational and it's scientific, but it's also spiritual. And again, at the risk of being as lofty and pretentious as the episode we're discussing, I think that's a very clever way of looking at it, and a way that makes sense for the character, and a way that actually does touch on profundity. It isn't just kind of like Carter rhyming off an article he read in some Scientific American journal. It's Carter actually saying something about the human condition and what he thinks and the way in which we're all connected. I think the episode lands that plane remarkably.
Oh, well, and it feels very sincere to me. Yeah. Like when some of the questions I noted down, she asked, like, will this all end one day? The Earth left barren like the stars above. Could we too become extinct? I don't think Chris Carter's putting this on. I think he's deeply thinking about these and he's kind of concerned with them. Yeah, I don't like the word pretentious. I don't use it very often because I feel like it's kind of unfair to kind of knock things for
trying
high, you know. Yeah. I don't know, Kurt, do you have answers to any of those questions Scully is asking? Will this all end one day?
Well,
Could we too become extinct,
Kurt? And Professor Brian Cox has basically said that, you know, it's the reverse of entropy, that eventually everything will just be separate, it'll all fall apart, it'll become freezing cold, there'll be no molecules moving together, and we'll die a very slow and painful death. And that'll be the end of the universe. So
it actually makes a nice. Is it Closure? A Sign on Z has the sequence where Mulder and Scully are staring up at the stars at the end of it and contemplating like the projection of light into the universe. So it's a nice kind of like companion piece to that as well. And again, that one also feels very much like the X-Files getting like reflecting on itself and Carter reflecting on himself as the guy guiding the X-Files, where it's like, will we survive as points of light out there in the cosmos? Will we be recycled into life yet to come? And yeah, again, it feels like a midlife crisis, but the show is, you know, going into its 7th season. It's allowed to have these midlife crises, I kind of think.
I tend to lean towards what Kurt was just saying, and I sort of think, okay, one day the Earth will be engulfed by the sun, and, you know, that'll be it, and hopefully we've had a good time in the process. And I sort of feel like there can almost be something liberating about accepting that. But I also believe that people with devout religious faith are probably a lot happier than I am, to be honest.
To be fair, none of us are going to live long enough to see the Earth swallowed by the sun, so we don't really have to worry about that.
Yeah, that is also true. Okay, Georgetown Memorial Hospital. So, yeah, again, quite shocking. Mulder in the special psychiatric unit.
And this is one of those missing segments. Like, when I talked at the start about, like, the episode, like, because it's so ponderous, and I sound like I'm being dismissive. I'm not. I love that it's so ponderous. But it is so, like, ponderous and so prone to these kind of voiceovers and these monologues and these abstract questions. It doesn't really try to do a lot of the basic connecting the dots plot work. Where, like, the last time you saw Mulder, he was in his apartment with Foley about to ask him some questions, and then you discover that he's been committed to a psychiatric institution. It feels like, you know, if you got this script from like a first-time writer, you'd be like, look, you need to do a bit of legwork here. It feels like you're missing about maybe one scene, maybe 2 scenes to get us to where we need to be. And the episode's just like, nope, Mulder is committed. He's already in a hospital gown. He's already yelling and screaming at the top of his voice, despite the fact that last time we saw him, he looked like he didn't have the energy to stand up straight. It's very odd.
And just remember, there's been 3 plane journeys to get there as well. She's taken 3 plane journeys.
Fair point.
Well, I was wondering, so like there are some missing pieces. Was this a natural progression, or has Foley had something to do with how rapidly Mulder's condition has deteriorated? What do we think? I don't actually know.
Well, just going back to that missing piece in the scene in the apartment, which it looks like it looks like she had severe concern because he just dropped to the floor. Yeah. So I'm a thing to think that this just happened all of a sudden really quickly. You know, that he's retreated to his bedroom. Which, you know, he's got a bed now, which something that I actually remember.
Thank you, Morris Fletcher.
Yeah. But no, it's not a waterbed, is it? It doesn't look like the waterbed anymore. It's a normal bed.
Well, because he had to replace it in Monday. He had to replace the waterbed in Monday, didn't he?
So he's got a bed now. He hasn't got a bathroom, but that's another story. But yeah, so I feel that it's just the case that because of how it started at the beginning and how quickly it's landed. Yeah, I think it's quick.
I can accept that. I think Foley, it's interesting that she makes a point of telling Scully that Mulder was asking for her last night. Of course, the implication being that she was with him at the time. This is where we get the stuff about he has brain activity in areas they've never seen before. There's a moment here where Mulder screams Scully. Now, apparently there's a disparity here where on streaming, if you're watching it on Disney Plus in the UK or potentially on Amazon, you can't hear him say her name, although it's subtitled on Disney Plus. But I checked on my Blu-ray and you can hear him scream it on there. I have no idea why that would be different between different platforms. It's kind of a shame, I think. Which versions did you guys hear him scream Scully's name in that scene?
No, I didn't, but I was aware because we've discussed this off air. So I was aware that it happened, so I double checked my Blu-ray and DVD as well. So, but yeah, it definitely doesn't happen. But it's memorable. It's a memorable moment.
Yeah,
and so I'm surprised that they've done that. I'm not quite sure why.
whether it was a conscious choice or an accident, even, because I mean these things can happen when you're remastering a show. It's possible that it's possible they missed it on an early copy or a late copy, and that's the one that got shipped out to streaming services. Because there are cases where that's happened, where there've been streaming copies of episodes and stuff that haven't lined up or have to be. Think of all the recalled discs and stuff, I suppose. Yeah,
or even things like in Fight the Future, where sometimes, depending on how you watch it, the subtitles say that Scully can hear she saw the spacecraft.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you watch it on the UK Blu-ray, for instance, it doesn't say that, but it's kind of a debate that rages.
I love canon and continuity. I love canon and continuity as defined by closed captioning.
Well, it depends. If you had to watch the X-Files with subtitles, you would just assume, and it said it, you would think that's exactly what, it communicates something very different,
The beginning would be a very strange experience for you.
Is it a bit too convenient that Skinner kind of reveals himself in that scene in the hall, where, when Scully comes back at him and is like, I never sent you that report?
You see, that's
Skinner,
why
terrible
I think,
poker player.
That's why I think that's done deliberately to allude to the fact that, that they're both lying, but for separate reasons. That's the way I see that. It's yes, it is a bit of a contrivance to say that I've seen the report. Well, how come have you seen the report? Well, because Krycek is surveilling you, and the fact that Foley doesn't know because she's prompting to try and get through, and obviously Scully's calling her a liar as well. So I think it's just that power play aspect. But that might be just me putting my own bias on it. I don't know, but that's the way that I feel about that.
Well, I do think in the next episode you get Skinner basically telling Scully, "I don't want you to tell me the things that you're doing." So I do wonder if it's possible to read that as a conscious slip on Skinner's part, where it's like, yep, I'm playing my hand, or I want her to realize that I'm not trustworthy, so that she will stop telling me things, so that I can, not lie to Krycek and get killed by nanobots, but also not betray her. So I do wonder, maybe that's an element of play there, I think.
Yeah, I do think it's a good Scully moment when she calls both of them liars. I like that. I'm actually looking at my notes here, and I didn't realise how deep we are into the episode already, because she hasn't gone to Africa yet, and we're like a couple of scenes from the end. Because we get the stuff in the office where, like I said earlier, I think that's an effectively unnerving shot where she's kind of about to reach for the camera, the phone rings, and she kind of looks back with that quite fraught expression on her face, So what, this is Skinner bugging them since SR819, is that what we're assuming?
Yeah.
Which seems rather surreal, because you imagine Krycek could probably get in and implant that if he needed to anyway. It feels rather redundant if your only role for controlling it is, to be fair, it is very Krycek. It's very Krycek to make Skinner do that, to be fair.
I'm just looking. So SR819 was before 2001 Sun. So I'm just imagine Krycek having some popcorn, just eating away, watching. Oh look, there's Smokey, and there's there's Bender. That happened. I'll save that for prosperity. So it is on videotape. That shooting is on videotape.
I'm still not entirely sure how Jeffrey Spender survived all that.
Well, we need to get that tape off Krycek. That's what we need to do.
Got wheeled out of the FBI headquarters without anybody noticing what was going on. Apparently, when it happened, I assumed that it was just they found his body in the basement and nobody talked about it. That was the logical assumption up until we get to William, and it's no. It turns out that it's much more insane than you thought it was, Darren.
Right, we're actually, like I say, we're coming up on the end of the episode here. So the Ivory Coast, 36 hours later. So more flights for Scully.
But twice as fast as the flights from the Ivory Coast at the start of the episode. I like that. We're building tempo. It took 3 days to get from the Ivory Coast to America, but it only takes a day and a half to get back. I like this.
It's a lot of expenses that they're using at the moment, isn't it? I wonder if that will come back to haunt them.
At some point, yeah.
Oh, the guy in Requiem. So she's taken to see something on the beach, which I think it appears to be an artifact at first. Then we see the omniscient overhead shot, and not the first omniscient overhead shot we've had in this episode, which I like. And we see the beach spacecraft to be continued. So perhaps not the same kind of gut punch as, for example, Mulder in the boxcar at the end of Anasazi. But I like it because, like I said at the outset, I think there are aspects of this episode that kind of produce that after effect in your mind. And I think this is one of them, even if it's not got the most visceral impact of all the cliffhangers. I think it is an interesting and striking one.
I always find it quite strange that it doesn't have that visceral impact when you see it. And the chord, we're talking about the music, the actual strong chord, that major chord that Mark Snow uses, and that wow kind of pre-Hans Zimmer kind of stuff. But yeah, it's and it kind of draws back, and it's like, oh, spaceship, all right, okay. But as you say, it's the kind of taking it in and absorbing the fact that it's Scully seeing it, and it's Scully that's going to be dealing with this.
Yeah, that's it.
That's like, okay, that's that in itself, giving it's a full. Remember, this is an end of season episode as well, so we've got a bit of time before this comes back to play. That you've got how's Scully going to pass all that into her brain and deal with this, and obviously we get that next episode. But it's I think you're right. I think it's something that might have a bit more of a bit more time to really kind of chew on before you actually start to get your full emotional aspect to it.
I mean, think about how different the episode would be if they cut on Mulder in the psychiatric institution screaming Scully. That would be a much more visceral, propulsive kind of like, oh my god, how are they going to get Mulder out of that psychiatric institution kind of ending to the season? And I know you can argue that would be just riffing on stuff like, say, Gethsemane or Folie à Deux or whatever, or even like going back to Anasazi and, that sort of stuff. But that would be like a real, let's grab the audience by the coat and just shake them and say, well, this is what you're thinking about for 3 months, as opposed to the shot of like Scully on the beach, the overhead, the God's Eye view, which, as Carl pointed out, is a recurring motif in this episode. Mm-hmm. Also in Gethsemane. Gethsemane has a couple of wonderful shots from Goodwin that like look like they're staring down at eyes in the floor, where you've like circles on the floor that look like they're staring back up at you as you look down at them, which are beautiful as well. And even like the shape of the kind of flying saucer, where it's a triangle, but there's a circle on it, so it looks like an iris. It looks like you're staring at an eye and the eye is staring back up at you. Again, that kind of Illuminati thing going on there. And it's a very striking image. It's not like a best of both worlds. Oh my god, I'm on tenterhooks wondering how this is going to resolve. This is like, no, I want to sit back. I want to think with this. This is, I don't wonder what the opening scene of the next episode is. I wonder what the next 2 episodes are, which is interesting, I think.
When I watched this episode yesterday, it seemed to me like that omniscient overhead shot in HD, I don't know if it's to do with the remastering or something, it wasn't quite as clear as the shots prior to it. I don't know if either of you... Kurt, did you see that? Did you see that?
It'd be probably the second unit would have filmed. Are you talking when you've seen Scully behind and it comes back?
That one, yeah.
It feels like it's a second unit, so it might have been filmed with a different camera.
I thought it might have been to do with the effects, because I imagine it was a big visual effect.
The visual effect cost $150,000, I think.
Wow.
I think that's what I've seen somewhere.
Okay, so the expenses person is visiting. Turns out that scene of Requiem was autobiographical.
Whereas now you could probably do it for, on this computer I'm sitting on now. So, but yeah, no, I think I might be thinking something slightly different. I'm looking at the behind scene when at the very end where Scully's looking up and there's a clear delineation between the quality between the two.
Yeah.
But no, I'd have to go back and look at that actually.
Well, it's often that way. I mean, there's a clear delineation in even the opening montage in like between say the stock footage. Yeah, that's exactly the stock footage, which is standard definition, and the actual artifacts that the crew had access to, which are high definition. And you can see that I think throughout like the X-Files on Blu-ray, where a lot of the special effects shots, because of how it was done, they didn't. And again, Carl and Kurt, you probably know more about this than I do. But things like, say, the project of remastering The Next Generation, Star Trek The Next Generation, where they would take the HD footage, scan it all, and then remaster the effects over it. So the effects would be redone in HD over the film footage, as opposed to just simply like remastering the film footage and taking the VHS quality where it was mastered on effects and upscaling that. I think some of the effects work on the X-Files Remastered looks like it was upscaled from the VHS mastering of the special effects. And I think that's the impact I get with that particular shot, I think. There are also moments like where you can see, and it's really odd because it's in like the standard 2-camera setup conversations that characters will have, where you can tell occasionally that it's like we couldn't identify the HD footage for one side of this conversation. And I think it happens in the Sixth Extinction with the character of Barnes and Scully on the beach, where Gillian Anderson's side of the conversation is like beautiful. It looks like it was shot yesterday, and Barnes looks a little bit rougher, and it kind of like, because they're bantering back and forth, it cuts between the two, and it's kind of, you are a little bit like, this is odd. This is a very odd mix. But again, to be fair, to the credits of the team who worked on it, doing 9 seasons of this, it's phenomenal, and it mostly looks gorgeous. So I feel bad when I occasionally go, yeah, but there's a slight hiccup here.
Yeah, I have no problem with that. The things I have more problem with are when they regularly spell Dean Haglund's name wrong on the new font, which happens quite a lot. They refer to William B. David a few times. That bothers me more, because I feel like that's something you can control more easily.
I do love that William B. Davis gets an Anne starring credit for like sitting in a meeting with an ashtray.
No lines. Not even a token line.
Well, going back to the pilot then, isn't it? That's another allusion to an old episode.
All right, guys, I think we should see what our XCast listeners had to say about this episode in the mailbag. So, some good stuff in, as usual. Let's start with Chris Henry, who said, good episode and season finale, an obvious sign they were taking the conspiracy in a new direction with the Alien Origins storyline, but always felt it was something they never finished off properly. A good start to a decent trilogy of episodes. Tony Black says, this is my favourite season finale. Not necessarily the best, that's probably Anasazi, but I adore the evolution of the alien myth arc into ancient astronaut mythology, the idea of biblical genesis and alien life. It reminds me of Gethsemane in the sense of how it ejects most of the main remaining myth arc players to simply ground Mulder and Scully in a mystery, and I appreciate how, unlike many finales, it gives Scully plenty to do and play a key role in the final act. Looks great, sounds great, filled with huge lyrical and mythical concepts. Love it to bits. I think Tony likes a nice stew of ideas, doesn't he, Kurt?
He does.
So this episode is kind of up his alley, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But he knows when he's saying, something of his personal favourite rather than, it's the best episode in the world. I mean, that's obviously Babylon, of course. But for you, Carl.
There was a point I wanted to make about Babylon in this episode, actually, which is when Mulder's in the university and he's walking down the hallway. There's a progression of shots that looks very similar. It's when you get the shot of Mulder's face, cut to him walking down the corridor, back and forth. That's very similar to the way Carter films Mulder walking down the corridor in Babylon.
I'm wondering if Bowman was off doing something else at that point, and Chris Carter had actually filmed that section.
Well, again, to be fair, if you want to kind of draw a serious connection, it's worth noting again the previous episode field trip was magic mushrooms, and it's like, this Babylon is magic mushrooms. Babylon is also much more than magic mushrooms, but we're not going to get into that right now. But I do think that you can draw a connection between the idea of how the X-Files visualizes consciousness expansion and going, that this is how we do it in visual kind of cinematic language.
And of course, there's a movement into Scully's eye in My Struggle 2, isn't there? Like there is,
that close up, that we talked about.
Yeah. Christian Ponce says, I like this trilogy, but it doesn't really work for me in the general arc. It goes off course a lot and opens a door that I don't like too much. Anyway, it has several moments that I still love. Andrew Levitt said, Biogenesis is my third favourite season finale after Anasazi and the Erlenmeyer Flask. The concept of alien genesis is really fascinating, and while the storyline didn't really go anywhere after this episode, the questions proposed here are really intriguing. Rob Bowman's direction is fantastic, giving the episode real momentum. We get to see the deal Skinner made with Krychek play out briefly, and we see Fowley still manipulating Mulder. Mulder's mental illness or affect from the alien craft fragment is really compelling, and I enjoy how old elements from the mythology, such as Albert Hosteen, are reintroduced here. Biogenesis is a fantastic way to end a somewhat questionable season. It gets a 9 out of 10 from me. It's interesting how a couple of commenters pick up on this idea of it doesn't really go anywhere. I mean, they are, I don't know what you thought, Darren, having seen the trilogy very recently again. They don't cohere, do they, exactly? They all kind of zig and zag in really weird ways.
No,
that's part of a charm.
That's it exactly. It's again, there's a real sense of, and again, I'm hesitant. This is mainly me reading into various interviews and various statements and the way in which the episodes come together. But there's a real sense of midway through the 6th season, Carter having the pressure on him for whatever reason from whatever corner to wrap up the mythology because the worry was that it was getting too big. And again, you could argue that that was probably the right thing to do, given that I think Two Fathers and One Son, the show never had higher ratings again. The ratings basically declined after that point. It was arguably the last point at which the X-Files was an event. Fox, I think, ran various myth arc episodes in the week leading up to it as well and took out huge advertisements, and it was all the secrets are going to be revealed and everybody was watching it, and there's a sense of, okay, well, you have to tidy up everything. You have to put all your toys away. So after he's done that, There's a real sense with these of it kind of, and again, I mentioned kind of poetry, but maybe freeform jazz or beat poetry is probably that's like good, closer to the sensibility that it's at. But it's like, yeah, this is what we're interested in. This is what we're doing. And it's like, yeah, it's going to include a subplot in which Mulder reenacts like the climactic third act of like The Last Temptation of Christ. Sure, why not? That's in there as well. They're going to be zombies in the Ivory Coast because sure, why not as well? Biblical like plagues, literal biblical plagues, because why not as well? We're going to kill off several important characters off screen because why not as well? We're going to bring back Albert Hosteen, who you probably don't remember unless you're a real hardcore fan from 3 or 4 years ago, because, well, why not as well? Christgau, yeah, he's back. His plot makes no sense whatsoever. It's hard to reconcile him being the same character. But sure, why not? That's in there as well. It's like that bit, you know, that Key and Peele sketch about the sequel Doctor for Gremlins 2? Like, where they're explaining how Gremlins 2 happened, and it's this guy who walked into a room, and he's literally pointing at everybody and said, have you got an idea? It's in the movie! It's like, yeah, have you got an idea? It's in the trilogy. And I like the weird freeform nature of it, because it feels so loose. And it feels like, again, it's people talk about how the X-Files mythology doesn't make sense. It makes a lot of sense. It mostly hangs together, and like, from Anasazi through to Two Fathers, One Son, it's a single story, really. And I like that it's like, okay, fine, I've done that. Now I'm going to do one for me. And this is very much a one for me. And I like it. I like it a lot for that reason.
I like that looseness, and I like the sense of, I couldn't really see anything like this anywhere else.
Yes, that's exactly
that's it as well. Let's just do a couple more comments. So a good one from Chandru Ravindran, who says, very enjoyable and powerful episode for all the reasons everyone has or will inevitably mention, so I won't mention those. I do love the usage of the Plague track from the Fight the Future soundtrack. It's a track that imbues the episode right from the teaser with this sense of inevitability. However, it's on a lower tier for me than most earlier mythology episodes because it's the rare Rob Bowman episode that I think is not well directed, like just weird decisions and shots. A crowded elevator is a good way to show that Mulder can hear a cacophony of voices, but having Scully engage in an intimate and deeply personal conversation with Mulder amongst said crowd is dumb. And Biogenesis has perhaps Bowman's worst camera shot when we watch Mulder and Scully talking outside of Skinner's office while Skinner peeks at them. It looks so obvious and looks like it came from the 60s Get Smart TV show. And boy, having a musical stinger as Diana Fowley takes off her shirt is just cringeworthy. Those examples make it sound like I don't like the episode, which is just not true. The episode is a solid 7 for me, but it just feels amateurish in spots, which I think is harsh. I don't mind the elevator because it feels to me like the most significant stuff that's said comes after the other people have left, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't hear what she actually says. Actually, in the elevator scene, speaking of field trip, there's a moment in that scene where there's a particular shot that looks like the shot before Scully like sort of fades away with the yellow gunk, which reminds me of that. The Plague track is interesting because SR819, it didn't work. There's episodes in season 5 where it doesn't work. I think this one works to a degree. I'm not sure I'd agree that I think it's great usage of it, but I think it works better than other aspects where they've tried to use the film score rather than a score which is more suited for the TV landscape.
Darren, did you have any issues with some of the things that Chandru highlights, like Skinner peeking? I can kind of see what he means with that one.
I can. I mean, it all feels very kind of heightened and very absurd. I mean, the parts of the episode that I don't necessarily respond to are the kind of soap opera elements of the things like Fowley and kind of Scully, and that kind of moment you alluded to, which is, he mentioned it to me last night, which is very like, watch our two female characters fight over our male lead, which is very awkward and kind of demeans both of them. It's very similar to like the Yusa gives them praise in the end, where it's like, one of them loves you too. And it's like, Gibson, stop being a manipulative little shit and just tell him what you know. Like, stop playing your weird people games. You kind of like miniature Charles Xavier. But yeah, outside of that, yeah, I can kind of see that. I can kind of see the elements like the Scarecord. I can kind of see elements like the Skinner drama being a bit much layered on top. Again, like yourself and like Kurt, I don't mind the elevator scene too much because it feels like a conversation that begins casually and then becomes personal in a way that it makes sense to, as Kurt points out, everybody leaves the elevator anyway. So it flows. That works for me. I don't have a problem with that. But I do think, the scare chord is... The scare chord is... I watched that... Like, I watched it twice today to prepare for this. And both times, I think I may have said out loud, what?
Why?
What?
Why?
Why did nobody stop this? Like, Mark Snow did it, and then Bowman left it in the episode. It's like, somebody somewhere should have raised a hand and gone, look, if you're gonna keep the scene, don't put the scare chord.
Yeah, it plays as comic to me, which is a shame because I find all the stuff with Mulder, like I say, quite affecting and distressing, and that kind of undercuts it, I'm afraid. But still, even what do you call it? Flaws in the diamond. I like the rough edges sometimes, but I don't think that works particularly well.
Yeah, like the fact, I do love that the episode is so esoteric and weird, and it feels kind of disingenuous for me to point out to bits where it's esoteric and weird, but in a bad way.
This is it. Let's just finally hear from Cathy Glinski, who says, when I think about biogenesis, I think about the way Mulder and Scully gaze at each other in Skinner's office, the way they stand right next to each other on the elevator, even when there's no one else on it, Scully's overwhelming concern for Mulder calling out for Scully all night when he's sick, the scene in the hospital where Mulder screams into the camera for Scully, knowing she's there without even seeing her, takes my breath away. I'm extremely bitter that it was deleted from Amazon streaming. I leave the episode knowing the Mulder-Scully relationship is strong enough to withstand whatever the heck Deana has
Mulder
planned.
was screaming for Scully all night the night before. And, where was she?
Yeah.
She was on a plane probably, so I let her off.
Yeah, she was in transit. But yeah, no, I think I like Cathy's comments because I don't often... When she says about them standing close to each other on the elevator, I think, oh yeah, of course. But I never consciously think of that myself when I'm watching.
Yeah, it's not, as again, I'm the same as you, Carl. I wouldn't have necessarily thought of that in that moment, but that's what I love about being able to watch and rewatch and take over people's opinions and discussions, because everyone views it at different viewpoints, and that would never have entered my mind at all. So it's great thing to realise. Yeah.
Okay, guys, I think we're about done here. I mean, Kurt, we've really gone quickly through season 6, haven't we? And we're going to be back with me and you and Sarah talking about our top threes, bottom threes of the season very soon. But Darren, we just thought we'd ask you for some overall thoughts on season 6, perhaps a favourite or two, or a least favourite or two. And just your general sense, really, of how this season stands in the X-Files kind of canon. It's a very interesting one.
Oh, it's absolutely a fascinating season. Again, nearly impossible situation for the cast and crew, moving from Vancouver to Los Angeles, trying to figure out how to do that. And I think I mentioned when we talked on 2001 Sun, I really like the X-Files Light era because it feels like the smart way of doing it. It's acknowledging that you're not in Vancouver anymore. You can't do the things that you took for granted in Vancouver, like have these incredibly moody environments that are constantly overcast, constantly dark. You can't get as far outside of your shooting base as you used to in Vancouver because Los Angeles traffic is crazy and because you're mostly surrounded by deserts. So if you want to get somewhere exotic, it's going to take you much longer and be much more expensive. So you have to work around that. So I actually really like that the X-Files Light as a production, as a piece of production, figures out, well, look, it's going to be sunnier, it's going to be brighter, it's going to be a lot more arid and deserty. So we are going to structure our episodes around that and do episodes like Dreamland, episodes like Drive, episodes like Triangle, How the Ghost Stole the Christmas, Terms of Endearment, and The Rain King. And I think all of that is commendable, and I think most of it works. I would argue, and this is perhaps controversial, but Drive and Triangle are probably the two best episodes of The X-Files that aired back-to-back, discounting Mythology two-parters. I think if you were to pick two solo episodes that aired back-to-back, you would probably not find a better two than Drive or Triangle. And somebody's going to come at me with two from the 4th season, and they're probably going to be right, but I'm just going to stick to my guns on this no matter what. I think, though, you run into problems in the second half of the season, in that I think once the show puts Mulder and Scully back in the office, it doesn't know what to do with them, and it also doesn't know how to tell the stories that it could tell very easily back in Vancouver. Whether or not that's because of the change in production, moving from Vancouver to Los Angeles, or because, the production team are exhausted and they've been telling these stories for 5 years now, over 100 episodes at this point. Whatever the reason is, once Mulder and Scully get back in the office, for me, the sixth season loses a lot of energy. I mean, I would argue Aguamala is one of the worst episodes of the season. Alpha is also downright terrible, I think, as well. I think there are some great episodes in that second half, like Monday, for example. I think Trevor is underrated. I like Milagro a lot. The Unnatural is fantastic. But I do think that, once you get into that second half, there's a real sense of, yeah, but how do we do the stuff that we'd spent 5 years doing beforehand? And it's not as easy as it used to look. So I think, the sixth season is ambitious. It's weird. I think the first half is stronger than the second half. And if I were to pick favorite episodes, off the top of my head, Drive, Triangle, and probably The Unnatural, just for how weird it is. I really like those 3 episodes. And if I were to pick a bottom 3 episodes, I've already named them, and I feel really bad that I'm singling them out again, but feck it, let's do it. In no particular order, Aguamala, the water squid episode, which is a very strange episode. Alpha, which wastes Sandy Robinson, and is inexplicably an origin story for the second version of the I Want to Believe poster that is never referenced again and has no mythic weight to it whatsoever. And then I'm kind of struck in terms of picking a kind of a third low episode, so I'll just leave it at 2. I'll say Aguamala and Alpha. I might go with Arcadia, but I feel like that would upset people, so I'm not going to.
Okay.
Interesting. How many of those favourites that you mentioned are those episodes that would be like jockeying for position in a top 10 of the entire series for you, or are they a bit below that, or how do you see that? Like Drive?
Drive is comfortably in my top 10. I think Drive is the latest episode chronologically of the X-Files to land in my top 10. Because I'm a nerd and I've done that. I've actually compiled it, but I think Drive would be, if you were ranking my top 10 episodes in terms of where they fall in X-Files chronology, Drive is where it dies. I think that if you extend to 15, it continues out to X-Cops in the 7th season. But I think that Drive is kind of where it ends. So, but I think Triangle would probably score a perfect 10 out of 10 for me as well. It's a remarkable accomplishment. I am dazzled that Triangle went out on television. Triangle is Carter doing Rope and doing The Wizard of Oz, and whether intentionally or not, stumbling on a way of making the gimmick of Rope work in a way that even Hitchcock couldn't, because he does it for television, and the length of a television act is roughly the length of a reel of film. So those cuts actually make sense within the structure of the episode and the story that he's telling. So I'm dazzled by Triangle every time I watch it. And The Unnatural is just fun. I like The Unnatural.
Kurt, anything you want to add at this point, or do we want to keep our powder dry until we talk to Sarah?
I think I'm going to hold back until the next episode where we discuss at length.
And Kurt will name Alpha as his favourite episode of the season, and I'll feel really bad.
I do actually have, as a spoiler alert, I do have a controversial one in the bottom part, in the bottom half of the season.
That's intriguing. Okay. Yeah,
he's coming for you, Tithonus.
Tithonus, actually, I did Tithonus, and I've reevaluated. I think it's top tier.
It's fantastic.
Tithonus, so,
it's really, really great.
All right, Darren. Well, thanks for joining us. It's been good to catch up with you a few times on season 6. We look forward to more in season 7, hopefully.
He has. He's recorded already. He's recorded Millennium with me already. So we're ready to go.
Very millenniumistic.
That's the first one in the bag, isn't it, for next season?
Yeah. We're just shuffling along there.
Yeah. What are you up to online, Darren? Where can people find you and all that jazz?
All right, so yes, I am absolutely everywhere online, apparently. But you can follow me on Twitter at Darren_Mooney. I write at the Movie Blog, which is with a 0 and 7 O in the word movie because I didn't register it quick enough. I write at The Escapist online, which you can find at www.escapistmagazine.com, or just give a Google for Darren Mooney Escapist. I do columns there every Monday and Friday. I also do videos on YouTube for them as well. So I'll do 3-minute reviews and I'll do in-depth looks at films and television and kind of exploring why they work or not. And I co-host a podcast, which I think both Carl and Kurt have been on in the past. I say think because it's been 260 odd episodes at this point. I've lost track of it all. But no, it's we've had you both on the past. It's been fantastic. It's the 250. I host it with my good friend Andrew Quinn, and we look at the IMDb's top 250 and bottom 100 movies as well. So you can find that with a quick Google on Stitcher and SoundCloud, wherever it's at. And I've also been all over the 3rd season of the Time Is Now podcast with Kurt as well. But I'll let Kurt give his plug for that if he feels like he wants to.
Yeah, well, Kurt, what about that? That's kind of, you've recorded all the episodes now, haven't you? So, but it's still continuing in some form.
Tony and I are in discussion about what it looks like at the moment. Even as we record, I've just seen a message on Facebook as we've been recording. So we're talking about that. We're going to have a wrap up of The Time Is Now, which is the Millennium podcast, which is, you can find that on Twitter at The Time Is Now pod, as Darren alluded to. Carl, you were on the first season. I think you appeared on one of the episodes in the first season, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've just wrapped up season 3. I've just done a commentary called on Via Della Rosa, which was the second to last episode of the season with Adam Chamberlain. And, we are in discussion about what the future holds. I know Tony's done an interview on the virtual seasons, and Darren, I think you're appearing on the comic book adaptation as well, which features Fox Mulder, of course.
It does, of course.
As well. So it's Fox Mulder and
it's
Frank
IDW's
Black,
one, which is quite nice as well.
Yeah, I quite liked that.
Yeah. So other things, find me on Twitter at rmuldrake. It's RMULDRAKE. I've also taken the mantle of covering Red Dwarf with Mark Adams and guest hosts, rotunda of hosts there. You can find that at Shipwrecks and Comatose, which is on Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod, shall I say, the Twitter at Red Dwarf Pod. And I've recently been on the podcast 616, which is the We Made This Podcast most recent podcast, which is all about the Marvel Universe, and which I covered the majority of the WandaVision episodes, and they are currently doing the Falcon and Winter Soldier at the moment. But the best place to find me is on the Twitter at rmuldrake.
That sounds wonderful.
Hey. Best place to find me is also on Twitter at J Sweeney. You can find the Xcast there at the X_cast. We also have a presence on Instagram and on Facebook. Of course, we've got the Basement group where there's lots of nice discussion. That's it. Like I say, season 6 wrap up coming your way very soon, listeners. But that's it for today. Always remember, until next time, trust no one.
Elsewhere on We Made This. Free with this month's issue.
If you think about the band name, they didn't even commit to being good themselves. Because Warm Jets is pretty shit.
Yeah, but it's Here Come the Warm Jets by Brian Eno is where they got it from, which is a fucking brilliant album.
Like, trying to do a rock band, naming yourself after a fucking ambient album.
No, it's a glam rock album.
Oh, is it?
It's not one of his ambient ones. So he's got Babies on Fire on it and stuff like that.
Fair enough, then. I still don't think being like, oh, we're the Warm Jets, like, okay, cool.
It's not an exciting name.
That sounds like someone pissing on you in the swimming baths, isn't it? What is that Warm Jet?
Wow.
Oh, it's piss.
Some people are into that, Ian.
I know. Not in the swimming baths, though, right? That's a bit invasive.
It will get you banned from Atherstone Leisure Centre, absolutely.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast.
How is it tiring that we've sat on our arses and watched something on a PC screen? But it really fucking is, isn't it?
Yeah, it was full on. It's full on. Fully enjoyable, but full on, yes, absolutely.
We haven't told people what we're reviewing yet, have we?
No, we haven't, because, that's why I'm edging around what we're talking about.
We're talking about the Holly Hop online Red Dwarf convention, which we both attended. And I tell you what, Kurt, I've had a bloody lovely weekend.
Yeah, it's been great. I've really enjoyed it. It's... As you say, the first day was hard because they've crammed a lot in the first day. Second day, overall, because I think it's been a bit more like a Sunday, because it's a Saturday-Sunday recording.
We Buy Records.
Eric Clapton and Van Morrison have released an anti-lockdown song. How do you think about this? Where does this sit on the shitometer?
I think it redefines the shitometer.
Right.
So I think it's raising money for musicians who are affected by the lockdown and the lack of gigs, etc., which is a good thing.
Yep.
But then you see Van Morrison and Eric Clapton, a bad thing. So,
right.
Do you know what I mean? I mean, I love Van Morrison's music. I don't particularly like Eric Clapton's music. I quite like the 60s stuff. But they're a couple of whinging old men, aren't they? Old man babies complaining that they can't go and lick whoever they want.
Ooh.
I know, but that's what they're singing about. I think I haven't checked that. I assume that the lyrics are about.
You can take it as read that I haven't heard it.
It's not likely to have a banging donk on it, is it?
It's unlikely to have a banging donk.
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.